Sure.
So where are you from originally?
New York, Long Island.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Where my wife's from Long Island.
Oh, really? Babylon.
Oh, the mic is on. Sorry. Babylon?
Suffolk County on the South Shore.
Babylon, New York?
My hometown.
Where did you go to school?
Went to Princeton.
Where?
Princeton.
Okay. Seems like a
Nice to meet you.
Tina Schrader, pleasure to meet
Great.
you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to our afternoon session here, and thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it. It has been an immensely entertaining day so far, and we expect the afternoon sessions to be just as entertaining. I'm John Schrader. I'm on the faculty here at the University of Nebraska School of College of Journalism and Mass Communications. I'm in broadcasting and sports, but I have a not-so-secret love affair with politics. Not so secret at all, thanks to social media. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Rick Klein, who's the political director of ABC News. He is based in Washington, D.C. He oversees the political unit, helps steer the network's coverage of major news events. Rick provides regular political commentary and analysis for all ABC News broadcasts and platforms, including World News Tonight, Good Morning America, abcnews.com, ABC News Radio, and News One. And I'm sure some days it feels like you do all of those in one day, right?
That's the way.
Back to back. The network's affiliate news service is News One. He co-hosts the Powerhouse Politics podcast along with the chief White House correspondent of ABC News, Jonathan Karl. Please welcome Rick Klein.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I've noticed that there's more politics junkies now than there were a year ago, kind of across the board, which I guess is good for business. But I want to thank you for the invitation, and thank you so much for having me here. And I'll leave lots of times for questions at the end. Sometimes there are questions about politics, that so I'm told. Just a couple of words about what I do. I'm the political director at ABC, which means I oversee the political coverage, television, radio, online, Facebook, Twitter. We provide the news really any way that you might want to consume it. If any way you want to read or hear about it, we're going to try to be there. Sometimes I'm on air, but just as often I'm behind the scenes helping with questions, planning a big interview or a debate, a little bit of everything. I was a newspaper reporter, most recently at the Boston Globe for about 10 years before coming to ABC News in 2007. The business has changed just an amazing amount in the last 20 years or so that I've been in the business. Things are moving faster, and they keep getting faster. The audience is getting splintered into new and difficult to understand ways. And then into that mix, Donald Trump emerged. Maybe I should say he exploded into that world, but here he is. So I come with best wishes from Washington, and it's a place that is a lot different than it used to be. And whatever you think of the current occupant of the White House, things are a lot different. But I have learned a lot of late, some of it from this unlikely teacher. So I do want to take you back to an early lesson that I had from a long time ago, from before anyone took a ride down an escalator at any tower. And I'm hoping we get volume too. Is there something I need to do to get volume? This is the wonders of television. You get to. Here?
Yep.
Is it muted?
No, I don't. Okay.
The sign out front. Well, 2016. Where we are in 5 blocks from the White House. A couple of times on the few questions. What's the likelihood as of now that you're going to be a candidate for president?
Very good. I mean, very strong. I'm looking at it very, very seriously. As you know, I have some of the best people in terms of your world. They're involved. And we're getting great poll numbers. New Hampshire just came out with a very strong poll. And nobody thinks I'm running. So when you really think you beat almost everybody in the poll numbers, they want to see a change. Politicians are all about no action and are doing a terrible job, tremendous disservice to the country. All they want to do is keep their jobs. And I know them better than anybody. I love them. I think they're great. It's easy to make money with politicians, but the fact is, it is all no action. Always talk, nothing happens, and the country's going to hell. So the chances are very, very good, and I'll be announcing something in June, and you will be surprised.
I'll be surprised.
I think so, maybe. I mean,
You've mentioned some of your potential rivals, so let's do a lightning round with some of them. Tell me what comes to mind when you hear some of the names. Jeb Bush.
stumbling. I don't know. I don't understand this man. He's stumbling like he's not even a smart person. So simple questions. What's going to happen when it's complicated? And I also think, I call him a reluctant warrior. Honestly, he doesn't look happy. He doesn't want to be doing this. I don't know, is the family forcing him to do it? But I'm calling him. I came up with the term. I don't think you've heard it from somebody else. I call him the reluctant warrior. And perhaps warrior is not a good word because I'm not sure he's a warrior. But he's a reluctant warrior.
Maybe he doesn't want to be in the
I don't
game.
think he wants to be doing it.
Marco Rubio?
I was so disappointed when I looked at his answer on Iraq. It was such a stupid answer and such a foolish answer. And he's got a lot of problems. I mean, if you read that front page story in the New York Times, I think he's got some significant problems.
Scott Walker.
I like him very much. I think he's a good guy, but Wisconsin, as you know, is piling on debt over debt. And that's going to be, I think, a big problem here.
How about Chris Christie?
Know him very well. He's a friend of mine. He's got a lot of difficulties with his, I mean, he knows it better than anybody. So I don't know if he's running, but he certainly has a lot of difficulties with what's going on in New Jersey and with the Bridgegate and other things.
Hillary Clinton?
Again, I know, from New York, I know very well. What she's done with emails is unbelievable. I think the book, The Cash, is a big problem for her. I think it's going to end up being a big problem. And even today, new revelations came out about the emails that are unbelievable. So I think she's got some difficulties. I don't think it's going to be that easy for her.
So you'll move to the White House?
When I look at the president who plays golf like he's on the PGA Tour,
Yeah.
he plays golf more than me anyway. I said, he's president. And I love golf. I have many clubs and golf tremendous. I have one to watching it. That's a phenomenal situation. I say, stay. You're in there for a limited period of time. There's so much work to be done, like including getting everyone together to pass things, which doesn't happen other than by executive order. Shouldn't be happening. So, we would do work hard. We would really work hard. We make this country great again. That I can tell you.
And you're living in the White House?
Yes, sir.
All right. Donald Trump, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have us back when this building is up and running.
It'd be an interesting year.
So an interesting year. I guess he was right about that. Any questions? Other than why I had that smile on my face there at the end, I wish I could ask myself about the gray hairs that I know I was going to get over the next 2 years, but I think I know kind of the function of that. But I do wish that I could stand here and tell you that at that moment I knew that I was talking to the next president of the United States. I wish I could tell you that I was right about just about anything that I thought back when we recorded this interview. I do know that I was way smarter a year ago than I am right now, so I appreciate that you're having me here anyway. But I would say that I've learned a lot, including some lessons that I think that Donald Trump was trying to teach me back on that day. That seems like it was a really long time ago. And my hope is that this helps you kind of survive and understand the new age of Washington, the new age of journalism, and it's not a normal thing, and it's really not changing back. I do want to just tell you just a word or two about how that interview came to pass, because I think it's a little bit instructive about this age of media and politics that we live in. Donald Trump had not launched his campaign yet. And a lot of people, maybe even most people, myself included, thought that he probably wouldn't. He kind of flirted with running for office quite a bit over the years. But I get an invitation from Mr. Trump's press secretary, a woman I'd never met, asking if I wanted to interview Mr. Trump. He was going to be in Washington the next day, and would I like to interview him? So of course I'm not going to say no to that. There's this, at the time, there was this big sign right on Pennsylvania Avenue, just a few blocks from the White House. Trump coming 2016. He was trying to tell us something. It was about his hotel, but I think he was trying to send a bigger message. But we get to we say yes to the interview, and I get there with my producer and camera woman for the web show that I co-host, and I see Mr. Trump coming out of the limo. Truth be told, you see his hair first. Like, I need to explain the picture. Like, you see the whole image of Trump, but he's coming out, and I follow him in, and Trump's people had never even asked me if the interview would appear on TV or online or anything. So he just wanted to do an interview. So we did the interview. You saw it. We wrap it up, and he introduces me to his project foreman, a big guy with a construction hat, and he says, "I want you to meet Rick Klein. Rick is the head of ABC News. He's the youngest head of ABC News in the history of the news. In the history of the news, he's the youngest guy to do it." I mean, he was giving me a promotion, I guess. I'm not the head of ABC News. I don't know if I would have been the youngest. I don't think that Trump knew either, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the bluster and the bravado, the confidence, the superlatives that he has come to be associated with. And I think it comes down to a basic force that I think he's understood, which is that so much of it is about power disruption. I like to tell people that we're in a political era and a news age where we move faster than the speed of thought. And the president, I think, gets that, and he thrives on that. He thrives on how quickly things are moving. The rest of us, often we're just kind of struggling to keep up with the news. I do want to set the stage a bit with a map that I think everyone in this room is probably familiar with. You don't have to understand the full map to know that this is the map that made Donald Trump President Trump. And you also don't have to know that much about electoral politics to know that actually, if you'd flipped only a couple 10,000 votes in the upper Midwest, he never would have won. And in fact, he lost the popular vote. And a lot of people remind us of that fact, and it is a fact all the time. But I want to show you another map that isn't as well known, but I think it's etched into the minds of the president and White House aides even more solidly than this one, which he likes to talk about. If you haven't noticed, he likes to talk about this map. But this is the map that I think he sees in his head. And it's actually just as accurate. And that is who won every county in the United States. You see that all of those pockets of blue kind of bleeded into red. And there aren't that many blue dots. Looks to me like Lincoln is one of them. Am I right? Looks like maybe, yeah. But I think anyone who spent any time out in the country as a whole over the last year, before last year's election, you saw signs of this. Literally, you saw signs of this. You saw Make America Great Again hats, and you saw signs that said Trump that were dotting the countryside far more than Hillary Clinton. And I think it's this map that is the basis for a lot of the president's confidence in his own convictions. And I'll get back to this, but I want people to think about this and think about the way that this matters to him in trying to channel the voice of the people that brought him into office. But I do want to offer some lessons from covering this president and the White House that I think can help anyone understand and adjust in this new media age. One big lesson that I referenced earlier that is that disruption is domination. President Trump wasn't the first to discover this, but he was the first, I think, to take full advantage of that in politics. And he wrote it all the way to the White House. And it basically goes like this, that if you're disrupting, you're making news. And if you're making news, then others aren't making news. Often it doesn't seem like the president has cared if it's good news or bad news. He just wants to be in the middle of it. He steps all over news cycles. The discipline that we saw with White Houses has totally gone away with the president that's willing to say or tweet just about anything. I think the president gets that lesson. I think he thrives on that lesson. He really loves just dropping a pebble into the middle of the lake that is the news cycle, and then watching everyone, us in the media, the Congress, his own staff, chase all of those ripples as they filter out. And then he might do it again and do it again. And I think we saw it just a few weeks ago when he was supposedly giving a speech to endorse a candidate in the Alabama Senate race, which of course has been in the news for much different reasons in the last day. But he's giving this speech on a Friday night, and almost as an afterthought, he included a few lines about professional athletes and how they needed to respect the flag. And it's really interesting to go back and watch it, because it was just a couple of lines in a long speech. It was almost a throwaway portion, something that was on his mind. But the crowd loved it, and they just ate it up. And it started to get some media coverage. So he followed up in the next couple of days with different means, new levels to what he was saying about how owners needed to stand up to the players. He started tweeting about it a lot. The news was covering it. It was the top story, I think, on our broadcasts the Sunday night after he gave that speech, and then the Monday as well on all our shows. And just when it seemed like it was fading a little bit, he sent Mike Pence decided to go to a game in Indianapolis and then leave early because the players kneeled, as of course they have done every Sunday for more than a year. And the goal here for President Trump, it wasn't about policy or any new directive. He was just stating an opinion, and he was just stating it in his typical very loud way. He was denounced for it very widely by people thinking about the First Amendment, even by people, I'd say, that have more Twitter followers than he does, like LeBron James was calling him out on it. But still, I think he gets what he wants out of that. And it meant that we weren't talking about North Korea or healthcare or that election where his candidate ended up losing down in Alabama. We were talking about him instead. Another big lesson that I think he lives and continues to teach is that in politics, words can be everything and also maybe nothing. We remember this candidate Trump from the campaign trail. He was going to build the wall that Mexico paid for. He was going to repeal Obamacare on day one. He was banning Muslims from entering the United States. He knew more about ISIS than the generals. He didn't need the briefing books or the experts in his campaign. He even wasn't going to go to the golf course, as he told me many, many months ago. Somewhat infamously, but I think importantly, someone said early on that a big mistake the media made was in taking President Trump literally but not seriously, when his supporters took him seriously but not literally. In fact, when you read stories or you talk to his supporters, a lot of them don't care about broken promises or whether he's doing exactly what he said he would do. They don't seem bothered by changes in policy or by frustrations that he suffered at the hands of Washington. And our polls kind of confirm it. We just were in the field for a poll marking the year anniversary, and north of 90% of Trump voters said that they would vote for him all over again. 91%, I think, was the number in our latest poll. It was down from, I think, 95% at the 100-day mark. But still, that's a pretty big margin a year in. Trump said in the campaign that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and his support might go up. And I think that was a statement, of course it's a joke, but his statement was about how his words his actions don't even carry meaning because he's able to repeat them with more actions and more words. You remember the incident a couple of months ago when early in the morning or overnight he typed the word confefe into Twitter. He tweeted out the word confefe, C-O-N-F-E-F-E. It's not a word in the English language. I don't think it's a word in any language. But to this day, the official line from the White House isn't even that was a mistake or a typo. They say that the president and a handful of people knew exactly what the word meant. I would say that for a lot of his supporters, they don't care what he meant, or that he's typing tweets in the middle of the night, just like they don't care about a lot of those promises that are unkept. And I think it's worth remembering that when you see stories about his approval rating. And I want to show this slide to give you a sense of where things have gone in his approval rating. So I find this fascinating because every couple of weeks there's a story out about how Donald Trump hits a new low in his approval rating, and I don't question any of the methodology around that. We did a story about how the lowest, I think, since Truman, which is modern polling, this far into a presidency, to be in the 30s. But the top line is his disapproval rating. The bottom line is his approval rating. This starts in July of 2015. Look at the number there: 61 disapproval, 33 approval. Take that all the way to Election Day, when he is around 60 disapproval, 34 approval. You see the numbers get close together around the time of the inauguration. I think people were kind of having confidence in a new day. But take it forward to this day, it's almost where it was way back in July of 2015. So in that time that he's been in public life, 2.5 years, it actually hasn't moved that much. And I think the president knows this. I think he also remembers that map that I showed a moment earlier when he's looking at this, because those numbers aren't distributed equally. Another big lesson, and I think it's an important one for the people in this room and elsewhere, is that checks and balances work, and they exist for very good reasons. We've seen President Trump been held back by federal courts. Even some of the judges that he's personally insulted have restrained some of the things he's trying to do. We've seen the Republican-controlled Congress openly defy him at times. Even a couple of senators, Republican senators, come out recently and all but state that they don't think he's fit for the presidency. Very extraordinary. We're seeing now the Republican Congress stall around his agenda. There's bureaucrats inside his government. They've leaked things that slow down or stop initiatives by shining a light on them. He's been warring with Democrats, but as I say, also Republicans, and people are standing up to him. His war on the party intensifies, but so does the pushback. His health care bill, of course, wasn't successful any of the times it was brought up. The tax reform bill is the big push now. We'll see where that goes. Other checks and balances, I mean, he had the director of the FBI all but call him a liar. He fired him, and he got himself a special counsel that, of course, just last week indicted his former campaign manager. Would he rather succeed than fail is a question I get sometimes about the chaos of this era. And I think, of course, the answer to that is yes. But I think that the president plays the politics of division very masterfully. Think again about that map in his head, to go back to it. Or not, because it's etched in my head. It can be etched in yours as well, whether I get it back. He knows the blue spots on that map very well. He's really from the blue spots. That's where there was a time, of course, where his politics were more blue than red even. But he is where he is now. And I also think that the President Trump gets the news business. And he's evolved his tactics as the business has evolved. And I think you can chart his journey over a long period of time, starting with the New York tabloids in the 1980s, right through the Twitter age right now. And you could learn a lot about how the news business has changed over that time. He is such a creature of the news that I think his evolution is the news cycle's evolution as well. And I would say that the news business is a vital check on power in the United States. And I think it remains so today, maybe more important than ever. In my time in this business, I've lived through evolutions and disruptions. I started as a beat reporter covering cops and courts for the Dallas Morning News, pure print reporter, where you just wrote, you went out there with a notebook and you wrote one story a day. I knew that if I went out there, I got a story, it ran in the paper the next day. And, big enterprise story ran on a Sunday. It was a very predictable kind of print existence. Then I moved to some political beats a little bit later in my career. I went to the Boston Globe. I'd say right now the kind of job I had where I was covering the State House and City Hall as a print reporter, it really doesn't even exist anymore. To the extent that there are reporters covering state and local government, which there are, they have to be covering for every platform. You can't just really be a print reporter anymore. And I've been at ABC now for 10 years, and my mandate is to reach viewers and readers really in any way they want to be reached. That's TV, radio, writing, blogging, tweeting, podcasting. If people want to consume news in a particular way, I really think it's our job to try to meet them there. I've done 3 different versions of web shows in my time there. I co-hosted with Sam Donaldson back in the 2008 election cycle. And I'll tell you, I'll never forget my first week at work where Sam Donaldson actually had to put on my makeup because I was so new at this job. I like to tell people that I'm platform agnostic when it comes to journalism. And I don't care how you consume news, whether it's online or on air or beamed directly into your head at some point, as long as you are consuming news. And I think it's our responsibility to try to find ways to get the news the way that people want it. And I think that thinking it in the context of President Trump, that he shocked the world with what he's done. And it's hard to believe for me that it's been a year since that election night. But really, we should have seen it coming because he didn't come out of nowhere. And it's in part because he understands the media as well as he does that he succeeded in politics the way that he has. I would say that sometimes there's a strategy to what looks like chaos from inside the White House because he puts himself right there in the middle of every news cycle. He's constantly interesting and sometimes outrageous, and I think he's mastered the art of manipulating media in a lot of ways. We have shorter news attention spans than ever, and I think the president gets that. We like to cover what's new and what's surprising, and I think the president gets that as well. We're highly competitive with other news organizations. The president gets that when he doles out interviews to certain news organizations that he likes. We like to interview candidates. I think Trump gets that. He says yes, or said yes, I should say, to the campaign to more interviews than probably all the other candidates combined. As I showed you earlier, he did that interview for my online show and never even asked where it was going to air. Not until after the fact was there any inquiry about is it going to be on TV or radio or where is it going to be. And then I think there's what he's come to represent. I think voters are frustrated at this moment. They're anxious, and I think Trump gets that in the way he communicates with people and the way he channels anger and anxiety. We do have the deal now with the White House that traffics in what was once called alternative facts. And the mocking tone that the president takes with the news media, he says that we're biased. And I would say that the one that really hurts the most is the term he uses of fake news. In fact, we counted it recently, and he's tweeted about fake news more than 120 times just since being in the presidency. That's about one every 3 days if you're scoring at home. A little more than that, actually. It's not a good trend as far as we're concerned here in the news business. And I should make clear that I really don't mind being called a name. I've dealt with other White Houses that call our reporting unfair or even biased. I don't like it, but I really don't mind it. You can call us names if you want. You can seek out other media to try to push back. I think that's all fine. But fake news to me is more problematic, and I think it's something people in the room should think about a lot when they hear the term, because it means that we're making it up. It undermines what we do, and everything from where I sit that I understand to be doing is undermined by that term. Fake news means you can't trust us at all. And that's what we need to push back on, because I think it is harmful and hurtful to democracy. My fear is a world of alternative facts is really a world of no facts at all. You can go and choose your own news. Maybe even worse, it's making up the facts as you go along. And there is real fake news that happens in this country. And in fact, there's a lot of stark evidence about foreign powers that have tried to plant fake news stories to try to sow discord among Americans. That's a lot different than using the term to describe a story or a piece of reporting you don't like. So I get the question all the time, how do we push back on that? What do we do about the fact that you have the president saying that and a good portion of the country believing that? I think the answer is that we do our jobs, and we do them as well as we can. It's really that simple. We're not going to win or, I think, win back the trust of every American, but I think what we should be striving to do is to slow things down for people, to explain and explore. And I do think in the context of the discussion this afternoon, to understand the forces that have driven the media in these directions, because I think if you understand them, you can understand this moment in politics just a little bit better. And I think that helps us actually do our jobs. We shouldn't be afraid to stand up for what we do, the jobs that we do, even for competitors as well. What we do is vital for democracy, and I would argue it's more vital than ever. So with that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. The floor is yours, John.
Early in the campaign, because everybody seemed to focus on Donald Trump to the detriment of all the other candidates, do you think that gave him the momentum? Because what the news media did, basically covering everything he did?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a question that I think a lot about, and I think we all think a lot about. and it's a hard thing to really unpack because, we cover what news is, and we cover what's interesting and what's surprising. And guess what? He was interesting and surprising. He also was a factor in the polls from an early stage. So it would have been a hard thing to do, to make a conscious effort to try to ignore what he was doing, to try to cover other candidates. I think we would have been criticized quite a bit if we weren't covering him. I've seen a lot written and speculated about the fact that a lot of cable networks were taking his speeches live throughout the campaign early on in the ways that they weren't for other candidates. That, I think, is an interesting piece. I will say, though, in kind of a general defense of the media, not to excuse everything or anyone that was done, but that he said yes to more interview requests than the others did by far. And I remember being part of teams that were trying to put together requests for people like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, and they were very selective about what they said yes to in terms of an interview. The Trump campaign wasn't. He just did interviews. And in retrospect, you can sort of discern the strategy of being this all-encompassing thing. But I think by the end of the campaign, people knew what they were getting with President Trump, and they voted for him anyway. So I don't think it was. I don't think that saturation coverage of his primary campaign made that decision any more or less difficult for people. I think the American people knew a heck of a lot about him. But I am definitely sympathetic to the argument that that other candidates weren't able to break through during that time. I don't know what would have been different. I don't know that anything would have changed the ultimate impact. But I have a lot of friends and sources in those other campaigns who, to this day, are very frustrated about not being able to break through. Some of them blame us, some of them blame themselves, some combination. But again, I think the way that he understood the news cycle is almost preternatural. I mean, he gets the business of news very well, and I think was able to use that to great effect.
Excuse me.
Hi, thanks for speaking to us today. So kind of piggybacking off of that, do you think that journalists have a responsibility in terms of their newspaper or their website to try to weigh the importance of news stories and put those as the biggest headlines? Whether, Donald Trump tweets about NFL is probably ultimately less important than war breaks out in Saudi Arabia, for example. Is what's most interesting to people the most important thing? Or is what's most likely to affect the world the most important thing? Or is that even a question we should be concerned about at this point?
Oh, I think, of course, we should be concerned about it. I mean, I remember back in my days at a college newspaper having a very tense meeting with a university administrator who said, all you're trying to do is sell newspapers. And I'm thinking, how many newspaper editors have had this conversation before? But by the way, we're a student newspaper. That's really not an issue. But more seriously, why would we want to put out a newspaper that no one wanted to read? And similarly, why would we put out a broadcast that didn't interest people? So it's complex. I mean, it's not like there's a news Richter scale that when something happens, it's automatically ranked higher. The NFL thing is actually a really good example, an instructive example, because you can argue, yeah, that doesn't affect any real people, whether or not players kneel on the sidelines. But what were the players trying to do? They were trying to shed light on racial injustice in policing. In fact, those protests started under President Obama. And that's been a huge issue in this country. And they were trying to use that platform to do it. And the president was calling into question their ability to have free expression. There's a First Amendment piece of it at right. By the way, more Americans watch football on the weekend than watch any other sport. I don't have to tell people in the room in Nebraska about how popular football is. So the president's words actually did have impact. I argue with you. I'd concede your point that a war with Saudi Arabia would be more impactful on balance, but it wasn't like it was in nothing. It is something that we wrestle with. I mean, just because the president does it or tweets it, in previous presidencies, a presidential statement itself was viewed as a news event. And I think there's another filter that we have to use. But it's complicated when it is the president of the United States because his words do have consequences. And even if as I said, there was no policy that was changing as a result of that NFL tweet. It was a big deal, and it had repercussions, and it's something that the country is grappling with even beyond the entertainment of an NFL Sunday. So I think our responsibility, a lot of what we have to do now is filter out the noise, because there's so much of it. And those are actually, there are lots of hard calls every day of things that you'd think in another news environment, man, this would be a really big deal. But because we only have a limited amount of time and space and reporting resources, there's a lot of stuff that just flies by. Catching the bits as they fly by and saying, wait a second, no, let's grasp onto this one, this is important. That's a lot of what I do on a daily basis, and I think is important for reporters covering politics right now, is to grab the bits that actually matter and decide that's where we're going to invest our resources, that's what we're going to dig into, and we're going to have to ignore those 10 other things, but this is one right here that we have to pay attention to.
Great.
Hey, just a little bit of that, but a little different spin on it, because I understand, like I was a consultant for Google for a bit, I understand the difficulties of the modern economy and digital publications. But for the students in the room, can you talk about how you decipher through all the noise, how you decide what gets published, and how they, as the people producing this work, are capable of selling it up to people like you who are directing the programs?
So which people that are producing? You mean reporters or? Yeah. So again, it's not, it's not a science. It's an art, and it's not a pretty art. Often we make mistakes. I would definitely concede. It's really, though, it's not like there's a magic machine that we put tweets through to decide if they're newsworthy or put stories through. It's a balance between what the surprise factor is, what the impact is, how it's likely to register with people. Clearly, things that matter for people's lives. I mean, we're gonna be covering this tax bill quite a bit over the coming weeks. We did a lot of coverage on healthcare because those are direct policies. I think the challenge in this era is that it's just a lot harder to focus, in part because there's so much out there, there's so much noise, there's so much popping 24/7, and in part, and this is not, as I discussed, this is not unrelated. You have a president who's so willing and able to generate so many other sparks off the news wheel as it goes on. The process, though, hasn't really changed. If our reporters spot something or think they have something, they bring it to editors. It's the same way that newspapers have been done for 100 years plus and news has been produced. I think it's harder for us to make decisions on an hour-by-hour basis because there's so much going on. I think some news organizations are just choosing to focus in a real micro level on a couple of issues, highlight a few trends in a bigger way. I think for us, it's a little harder to do that because our broadcast is viewed in every community by all sorts of different people every night. But it's definitely an evolving process from where I sit. And if people have story ideas, we want to talk about them. We also, though, need to assign them and focus on them. So to me, that's the balance. Is we could easily fill 2 hours every night of news out of Washington. But the fact is that World News Tonight is a 22 minutes of news hole. And in that 22 minutes, Washington coverage is a lot more of that 22 minutes than it was a year or two ago. But you also want to tell people about the health breakthroughs that are going on and the weather that's going on somewhere in the country, and maybe an uplifting story or two. So that you have to balance a whole lot into a finite news hole. Even in an online age where you have so many other opportunities, you still only so many stories you can tell.
Okay, right here.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I have a question about when you're working with journalists and reporters, how do you navigate Washington now? How do you coach them to get the facts and get the truth with an administration that's so kind of guarded and combative?
Yeah, so it's a good question about the guarded and combative thing. I would say, first of all, this White House isn't markedly more guarded than other White Houses. It is more combative. But the guarded piece of it, there's a lot of stuff that comes out of this White House and this administration, and even Capitol Hill. That's one of the big changes that Trump has. We had a lot of frustrations in the Bush White House and the Obama White House about just getting the most basic details of what was going on. We're not having those same kind of issues. Now, what we get out of them isn't always right. It isn't always accurate, but we're getting stuff. So in a way, the challenge is different. any reporter worth anything in Washington right now can get people to talk to him or her. That's really not a problem. Getting people with authority to talk and to talk knowledgeably and then take that and use that to inform real fact-based analysis, that's actually a lot harder. We're living in an age where there's so much stuff that's flying out off of the White House, out of Capitol Hill, out of the major administrative beats that you just can't trust, or you can't trust on face value. So I think it puts a focus, to my mind, on facts and figures. It makes documents more important than ever, because if something's there in writing, it's harder to dispute. I think one thing I do with reporters all the time is, we push back a little bit on the motivations of people that are putting something forward. Why would someone know this? Why would they want this? And if there's a way to portray that they're doing this potentially to try to undermine someone else inside the White House or the administration, that's a piece of it. I think it's training us to be a lot more skeptical of what we're told by government officials, which is probably on balance a good thing. But again, we're not lacking for material to report on. We're lacking for the ability to synthesize it and analyze it.
It has not been the tradition of American journalism to essentially call presidents liars and use that in print and in broadcast. Is that healthy to do that? And what is the position, the policy of ABC News when it comes to calling the president or anybody else untruthful?
Sure. Well, the two different words you use there, untruthful and liar.
And I meant to. Thank you.
Yeah, but they're important in my mind. And I'll say we don't have to my mind, it's not written down in policy that you can use the L word when these conditions are met. I will say that as a journalist and in my team, we're very careful about applying the word liar to anyone, because that connotes not just a reckless disregard for truth, but knowing that it's untruthful and misleading. It also kind of takes out spin in the whole world of that. I say without any hesitation that the president has said things that are not truthful. Going another step, I think that's for anyone to make their own judgment whether they do it. I think there's some reporters who feel strongly about saying that makes him a liar. There's others who say I don't want to go there. Personally, I think if you can point out something and say that statement is not accurate or has no basis in facts or is not truthful, that to me is a comfort zone, because I can prove that with actual facts or undermine the credibility. I think that's important. I'm also mindful of the fact that if we go and label someone in this news environment as untruthful or making it up or a liar, there's a lot of the public that's going to think we're the ones that are lying and we're the ones that are untruthful. I think it personally is more powerful if you combat that not with a name, not calling by a name, but by bringing facts to bear and say, well, here's the evidence that we have gathered that show why, in our judgment, that is not an accurate or honest statement.
So do you think, kind of going back to more of like the filtering out what you deem as newsworthy or what should be reported on, do you think journalists have become too infatuated with the Trump administration and like their actions and the noise and the constant tweeting, rather than focusing on like the cold hard informational news? Kind of like, for instance, in Trump's trip abroad in Asia now, there's articles on him, like we saw, dumping too much fish food in a koi pond, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders wearing pearls in an army jacket. Yeah. Whereas me personally, I don't care about that. I'd much rather have like information about what's actually being discussed over there. But yeah. Do you think people are kind of focusing on the wrong things rather than informing what should be informed?
It's a great question, and I actually think it's broader than Trump or the Trump presidency. I think the office of the presidency and the president himself has grown kind of overanalyzed, over-scrutinized, far even beyond the vast powers of the presidency, the way that every action of a president is viewed as potentially historical record or the major faux pas. Going back several presidents, you could make that same argument. You can also argue that it's more important now to focus because there's so much other stuff on there and the stuff that really matters. I think that when something happens that that is viewed as a gaffe or a mistake or a faux pas, I think we have to apply another filter now that says, first of all, is it? And the fact is, like the koi pond thing, if you had seen the Japanese prime minister a few seconds earlier, he actually did the same thing in dumping. So is that a major diplomatic incident, overfeeding some fish? Probably not. Cool picture? Yeah. But you present it as such. So I think you have to filter, first of all, is it actually a true, is something that just happened a true outrage or something that we need to raise alarms about? And then secondarily, what the impact is, and in the context of what else is going on in the news that day. And often the answer to that question will be no. I also think, we get too much credit for, it's not just at ABC, but I think anyone in mainstream media, for being kind of the arbiters of those things. That picture of the president feeding the fish would have gone viral whether or not it got put on our air. I actually don't know if it did. I don't even remember if it was something that we put on World News Tonight. But that was a thing on the internet with or without ABC's help. So in some ways we can't control those things. But we can control what goes on our air, and we can make sure that we're presenting pictures, events, occurrences like that in the right context.
Okay. One final quick question and quick answer. Broadcasters watch their watches.
I guess I can't totally promise that it's going to be quick. It's kind of a long-winded question. But when you were showing the map of the different counties in the country, and so many of them were red, I couldn't help but think about a county that we have here in Nebraska, Grant County, which has one of the highest percentage of Obamacare enrollees, but also overwhelmingly voted for Trump. And I wondered what your perspective was on sort of why people are voting against their best interests like that. And when people vote against their best interests like that, do you think it just kind of reinforces this idea that we're living in like a post-fact and like post-truth era?
It's a great question. First of all, there's nothing new about people voting against their what might be considered their best interest, best economic interest. There was a book that came out 10 or 15 years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas that made that exact argument, that Kansas should, by all rights, be voting Democratic, but is now a heavily Republican, very red state. A couple of things. One is, I think people vote for candidates for president or any office for lots of different reasons. One reason would seem to be economic self-interest or healthcare self-interest, but it might just be that you think you think Donald Trump has a better foreign policy than Hillary Clinton, or you think he'd be a stronger leader, or you think that Hillary Clinton is just worse on all these accounts, or you just like his hairdo better. There's nothing that says, maybe not that many people think that, but there's nothing that says in the Constitution like these are the criteria that people have to vote for. You can vote for someone or against someone for any reason you want. That's the way the system is set up. That said, it's our responsibility to educate people about the consequences of policy. And it may seem hard to believe for a lot of people why someone would vote against their self-interest in that direct a way if you benefit from Obamacare. And there's a famous story, maybe apocryphal, about someone saying, I don't care what happens as long as the government gets its hands off my Medicare. Right? So it's possible that people don't understand fully the consequences of every action and don't understand all the policy. But I think it's our job as journalists to understand and to educate and to talk to people like that. And there may be great reasons. There might be really wrong reasons that they have for making that vote, but there might be really valid reasons as well. I think what I said earlier about Trump's supporters taking him seriously but not literally, I think is an important insight in that for a lot of people that voted for him, they never thought that he was actually going to get rid of Obamacare on day one or build the big beautiful wall or ban Muslims, but they liked the idea that he was going to shake things up. So that might be an explanation for the voters that you referenced.
Okay, well, thank you, Rick. Fabulous. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Great to have you here. And we'd like to say a big thank you to Roger Moody and the role he played. Roger, are you in the room? Roger, the role you played in getting Rick here, thank you very much. We appreciate it. So now you'll be watching and listening to Rick's podcast with a little more interest, I would guess. So thank you so much. It's great. There you go. Great to have you here. Or watch a commercial or two. That's what we say in broadcast. Okay, so Deb will be here in just a couple of minutes. After Deb's presentation, which starts at the top of the hour, there will be coffee and water available outside the room. So there'll be a little bit of a break for something to drink. Following Deb's presentation, he's going to set it up, and it'll start in just a few minutes. Okay? Thanks.
That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you. Saying that. No. This was from the local station here.
Oh,
The ABC station.
straight line. This is the straight line. Yeah.
I've done this a million times, so I'll just make a quick introduction here for you. Is that all like this is you?
Yeah. And if you want me to stop at a specific time, just let me know.
I'll give you an eye contact and I'll give you like a 5-minute warning or something.
Yeah.
How much time do you want to leave for questions?
You decide.
No, it's up to you. So, okay. Minutes is probably usually good, but
okay, great.
We'll start right into it.
Thank you.
Across the country for 45 minutes. I hope they treated you well.
Yes, of course.
Sounds like your mic is on, sorry. Whisper. It's okay.
I thought maybe I probably should keep my day job and go have a glass of wine. And you're a professor in journalism?
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's time to get started here with our 2 o'clock session. And a reminder that following Deb's presentation, coffee and water available in the lobby. So we'll get on with Deb here. Associate Professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, Dr. Deb Eicat joined the School of Media and Journalism in Chapel Hill in 1995. His forthcoming book, Who's a Journalist? News in the Digital Age, theorizes the role of a free press as a democratic institution. Dr. Eicat was recognized as the inaugural winner of the National Journalism Teacher of the Year in 2003 for his service in journalism education. He earned his certificate in American political culture from New York University and a PhD from Ohio University, and he asked me to call him Deb. So please welcome Deb to the program.
Thank you, Professor Schroeder, for that nice introduction. So I just wanted to tell you 2 disclaimers. I speak English with an accent, and you will soon realize why. Second, I really wanted to thank Dean Maria Maran for organizing this, and she asked me to send me the slides, which I did, and she told me last night that my slides, they were 77 in number. I corrected her saying that now it's 82. So let's see how many slides. I'm in no hurry to get to all of those slides, but I want to get to all of them, so fasten your seatbelts. We will be on a fast journey. Okay, first some introduction about me. This is how I looked, 1995. This is a gift from my brother, who made a cartoon of me, and the rest is history. I lost my hair and my mustache. I was born in India, just to give you a little bit of a background, I worked at the Telegraph newspaper. I reported for the BBC, and then I came to UNC Chapel Hill, and I became an American citizen in 2003. So I have been in 2 vibrant democracies, India and the United States, and I've created trouble as a journalist in both places and survived. So today it will be no different. And we are going to talk about that. But I do also want to tell you my special association with Nebraska. This is my first visit here, but because I was involved with Ohio University, I knew Dean Maran from her days as a PhD student, and then I joined AEJMC, where I met all of the stars from Nebraska, like Dean Koppel, Dean Will Norton, who I still keep in touch with, Dean Gary Cable, and Dean Maran, and all of the people in the college. I mean, if I start naming all of the friends I have at Nebraska, we'll be done. So we won't do that, okay? So I do want to tell you in the spirit of full disclosure, and I do that in most of my classes on the first day, this is my voting record, and I am unaffiliated, so that if I say something nasty about somebody, you know that I'm unaffiliated, and I live my life that way. On voting day, I do vote for a party that I'm not going to tell you, but anyway. So I'm working on a book. It's in its final stages, and we are going to explore who is a journalist in the digital age. But I wanted to take a minute. This has been a great day where I have found some wonderful things discussed, and I agree with all of them, and I disagree with some of them. And so in a minute, I'll share that with you. But while you are listening or seeing some of my slides, think of how journalism is happening outside of the realms of a traditional newspaper, traditional journalism. Think of who is a journalist. For example, That's a flag of which country? Somebody help me. Germany. So there is an advertising agency in Germany. Just before the inauguration this year, they published a little app. Now, you all know what augmented reality is. You don't have to know what augmented reality is, quite honestly. Just imagine that you can conjure up an image using US currency. Now, somebody help me. George Washington, another George. George Washington is the father of our nation. In which dollar denomination you find him? $1, thank you. So this was really smart. The advertising agency did not pick a Benjamin. Benjamin is what denomination? 100. So it's easier to find a dollar bill, and this is what happens when you get to the dollar bill. So this is an augmented reality. Remember, it was around January 21st, and think of the message that's being conveyed. The message was really simple. You know how they have 140 characters to circulate something, but just notice what is going on. This was produced in Germany.
Politics as I knew it has changed. Subjective perspectives outweigh pure reason. Eloquence is limited to 140 characters, and the world builds walls instead of bridges. I'm truly worried about the state of our democracy. As I told you before in my farewell address, cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men could rise in the struggle for power between political parties. In last year's campaign, I witnessed the agitation of the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarm. Or should I say, fake news? I saw the fomentation of riots and insurrection between parties, people, and ethnicities. But don't get me wrong, Donald. The land of the free gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth.
Does this message resonate with you? And especially during inauguration, and what happened the day right after the inauguration, there was a women's march. If we can get to the slide, we'll discuss a little bit of women's issues. But you can try this at home or at your workplace. Don't just do it here, because you will miss all the slides I have. So today I wanted to, so this was a non-journalistic entity conveying what would be traditionally a journalistic model. You know, and let me share with you, just throw it in, a model that is very vibrant in the public relations / advertising industry, and it's relevant to today's discussion because we are getting into that world where this is happening, and you know some of this. Paid media is what you pay, advertising, and I know some of you are interested in advertising. Owned media, what could be an example of an owned media? An app, a website, which you own. The White House has a big owned media in its website, and it has messaging constantly going on. Owned media could also mean the New York Times, because that's an owned media, right? Now, earned media is what public relations always aim at. So when I played that little app before you, that was earned media. That person did not pay me in the spirit of full disclosure, and even if they would pay, I would not be influenced by it. But what I'm trying to say is, earned media is what Donald Trump got a whole lot. And you don't have to take my word for it. Jeb Bush had $52 million and more in his coffers. Nothing happened. Donald Trump did not spend $52 million, except if you leave out the flights he took, which would cost a lot of money. But think of these three things: earned media, paid media, and owned media. And I'm not going to talk about shared media because you know it all, in the sense that, so think of how in this whole dynamics, this is happening. And this is relevant because Donald Trump is a hardworking president. We all know that. He wakes up in the morning and he sends tweet messages. So this is the message that came on afternoon, actually. And as you can see, Peter just spoke, and if he was reading this message, the folks at ABC would have envy, right? Why? Because ABC wasn't mentioned, right? This is like a big area. Now he went back and he added ABC. So he was like, so think of that. This is a president within 18 minutes. He corrects his message. Of course, it was enough time for us to archive that. But so that's another thing. The messaging is coming from the president. And much as you wish to, you cannot ignore the words of the president, however ridiculous or however cogent they may be. So I wanted to get to another point. This tweet really reflects a very important part. Trust in media. When you call an established media entity or established media entities fake news, it relates to trust. So I looked at what's happening with trust, and this is a good place to talk about Gallup because, you know, Nebraska is home to a lot of Gallup initiatives. So I would like you to read through this question, which was first formed in 1972. Think of that. How many of us are really using newspapers, television, and radio? I mean, in that form, in that old form. So I think, I don't want to advise Gallup, but I am. I think they should revise this question. But there is another important point I wanted to share with you. This is how the graph looks. If you look at the time the question was asked until today. Now, as you know, this is a good group of people that appreciate graphs. So there is a little up. 5 points, and we are all happy. Like, well, media, there is more confidence. But I wanted to go to one important thing. Why has America's trust in media declined? Why? And let's try to talk about that for a minute. And the second is the agenda that we all have. How can we make skeptical people believe in real news? Because I find, I teach a lot of students and I work with a lot of researchers. Some of them tell me that they ignore the news. News will come to me and all sorts of things that you may. So let's investigate why. So I try to find out in all of those days, when was trust at its peak, which is wonderful. And it was in the 70s. Can you tell me what happened in the 70s? Thank you. What else? Yes. So this is what I don't even. So Cronkite was there. Cronkite was a journalist, as you know, and he went to Vietnam. And you know, if you can go there, you can see the clip, but it's not relevant. The Watergate happened. A small burglary turned up into a president suspecting to resign. Then he resigned. Right? And believe it or not, this film is not just a film. It was shown all over the world. And I don't know if you would agree with me, it led to a revival in journalism education. A lot of people I know came to journalism because they loved this. And I'm not saying, I mean, I may have been one of them, but what I'm trying to say, in far-flung India, where I was a journalist, I got a greater understanding of what journalism can do. So, but there are other things. I told you that little thing that has come up, 9 points. We are still happy about it. But if you look at it from a very scholarly level, media trust has always been going down from our heydays in the 70s. And it's unfair to say, what is another reason? In the 70s, you had only 5 big media entities, the 3 networks and some newspapers. And today, what is media? Or what are media? In our school, we don't use a singular verb for media. What are media? I mean, the itty-bitty fake news source is also media on a bad day or on a good day. And then the best newspapers or the best news entities are also media. So media are a collective term to describe something which is like love. I mean, you can have bad love and good love. I mean, why would you describe media in a one term? So there is no way to do that. And that has also led to some other insights. So we call this the Trump bump. And this is from Bloomberg. think of what has happened. And this is not an exaggeration, these are real figures. 57% rise in share prices, New York Times. This is good, right? But this is also bad news. So much as we celebrate, by the way, this is positive and this is negative, you knew that. But I wanted to share with you, think of McClatchy. McClatchy owns newspapers where? Anyone? Small local communities, yes. Small local communities. Small local community papers are not doing too well. You have Below and Gannett. I mean, Gannett is barely doing anything. So what I'm trying to say is these are very important pointers that we have to get to. There's another worry. And that worry relates to a lot of people who are younger, 18 to 49-year-old. These are definitions by Gallup. And think of the big widening gap. So younger people are more distrustful of media, if I can use that term. Why? Do you have an explanation for that? Well, let's move on. So I wanted to share with you, well, your silence says it all. I wanted to share with you a geeky term. Yes, Dean Marin. Well, then you have to let me present my 80th slide. No, thank you. No, seriously, let's go back. Why are younger people distrustful of the media?
Poor childhood nutrition.
So that could be a reason. But I think the real reason is this. First, when Gallup is asking this question, remember, they're asking people 18 to 49-year-olds. So they're not only young people. They're also, I don't know, would you consider somebody in their 40s young? I mean, you would, but that's a large group. My son would not call me young. But anyway, you get the idea. So this is also, you have to splice it up. But truth be told, younger people, they do not trust everything. They're skeptical, period. And so that is why there is a lot of skepticism in terms of what they are seeing or hearing. And also, a lot of their media consumption is sharing. So when you are sharing the news, you do not have one fixed entity that you go to. And, I listen to NPR while I'm washing my dishes. Why? Because I can hear and still make sense of washing my dishes. A lot of younger people are not doing anything like that. They listen to mindless music. No, I'm serious. And this relates to a very important thing. So the answer to Dean Marin's questions also exists in this. And I did not ask her to tell me this, but how many of you have some kind of a gadget like this, which was founded in a big way? Okay, great, that says it all. So this little gadget was marketed as a phone, but I'll make a little case to say that it is not a phone anymore, right? Like American Express had an ad, don't leave home without it. Now this is the don't leave home without it, right? So what has happened is there is disintermediation, if I can say that right. What is disintermediation? In the earlier model, when you heard Walter Cronkite, you heard Walter's definition of what was happening in Vietnam, right? When you read the Washington Post defined what was happening with Watergate. Today, that direct access to information is in a different form. Today, younger people or older people, anybody can get direct access to information. So, today a journalist's job as a mediator is lessened. I'm not saying gone, it's lessened. A physician. How many times have we found about something just by typing it in? And you don't have to take my word for it. Google has a new application, Flu Trends, not new anymore, by which, by the way we all search, it can predict the flu 1 month before the public health officials in Atlanta can predict it. Why is 1 month? 1 month is critical time to prepare for vaccination. So think of that. So the way you search. So in other words, there has been media disintermediation, right? So that's an important term. So I'm going to explain media disintermediation in another way. What is the best camera you have? Okay, good. What else? The one you have. That's a great answer. The best camera is the one you have. Is the best recorder, right? The best notebook, the best connection device, right? The best scanner. And some of my colleagues and researchers tell me, at least in India, and it's true here, that for them, or at least they know about it, it's the best device to start a breakup. Why are you all laughing? So, there was a court verdict in the Supreme Court in India where they mentioned, and this happened in the summer, where they mentioned that the judges expressed concern where some of the breakups were happening on, like with the help of a smartphone message. So think of that. So this is another example of disintermediation where the camera is gone, the recorder is gone, and it had been disintermediated. So this term is borrowed from marketing, where you have the manufacturer, consumers, and then there is an intermediary. Not that the intermediary is gone. The intermediary has come back, and so to make it more geekier, it is re-intermediation. So one example is content curation. Today, it's not enough that you read the news, you curate the news, but there is media disintermediation, which basically means there are innovative products that give you a value proposition. Let me explain that. What could be a good value proposition? Here is a good value proposition. It's no more cool to use a mobile phone. A lot of people are tired of using a mobile phone. They want to use a little device that is wearable, and you don't have to worry about much. You can look at it. You can look at it even when you are a busy meeting on how many people are messaging to you. So this is an example of re-intermediation of a watch. How many people, just out of show of hands, are using a traditional watch that was in the 70s? Okay, that says it all. And the rest of you, how many of you have a device that helps you keep time and more? See? So, as you can see, the re-intermediation is happening, and you can take examples to other things. So this is a concept that I'm trying. Let me tell you, so disintermediation is not only a term I came up with. The editor of Time mentions about disintermediation. And she says about a viral graphic that was more powerful than an editorial. Now that I have pitched it enough, would you like to see that graphic? Sure. Of course. So I'm going to show you just 1 minute of it.
Almost done here, that's great. You don't show the aspirin.
His aspirin.
I'm doing this for the cover of Time magazine. I love Time magazine. What you will do for a cover, this bird is seriously dangerous, but she's beautiful.
So how many times do you think a video like this would have been re-forwarded, retweeted, and played around? Well, I have the answer right there. And growing daily. More than 3 million. Think of that, a little video. Now, I bet you, Los Angeles Times had a series of editorials that were trying to talk about Trump. And nothing wrong with Los Angeles Times. I love that newspaper. But I bet you they would not have so many views. And of course, it takes time to read an editorial. This was a very pithy message, which was funny and at the same time topical. So again, non-journalistic acts that mimic journalism are making a big impact on the political agenda or any agenda. And of course, this was a media take. I'm going to skip that. So here is what Donna Allen says about the whole culture of what you are seeing or what we are observing. So, you know, the Neiman Reports published a big issue in November 11, 2016. And he says we are transitioning from a text-based to an oral culture. I don't know if you would agree, but I shared with you some examples. The second paragraph, would you agree on that? They watch or listen to the news rather than read it. Just as an example, think of how comprehensive Hillary Clinton's whole manifesto was and how shallow President Trump's promises were. And as Peter said it so well, some people took him literally but not seriously, and that could be a classic, title of a book. Which device will succeed the smartphone? This is my challenge to everybody. This is what will solve a lot of the things that we are worried about. Because, can you give me an answer? What do you think? Which device will succeed the smartphone? Because, the second answer relates to the first. How to get news to people away from the phones. So obviously you are looking at something so we are working on another book with Don Shaw, myself and David Weaver and Chris Vargo and Milad Miloy, which would explore how we are melding our agendas. So why do we talk about agenda melding? Because there is a plethora of platforms, right? So I can bet you can pick 5 things that you use, like Wikipedia is right there, Google is right there. But at any point, these platforms are making a big impact in your life. And so let's get to a summary of journalism, in the sense that I looked at Melville Mencher's whole philosophy of what he was doing, and actually CNN's Richard Griffith, who is the editorial director, he shared this with me in terms of how whenever in the CNN newsroom they're trying to talk about the spirit of their mission, they have seriously discussed this. So as most of you would know, that Melvin Mencher was a professor at Columbia University, and that's his book in its 12th edition. So let me take a minute to explain this to you. So layer 1 is spin and spinach. What is spinach? Spinach is the gobbledygook you heard in 2002, 2003, saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, right? Did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? Not really. That would warrant a war that is still on. So that is spinach. Spinach could be also that government statement which you publish and stuff. But this is layer 1, which is basic. Public relations, advertising, which gives you all this information. You have no control of the story. That happens. That also happens on social media. Layer 3 is where we all have a similar thing, opinions. You can have any opinion, you can say anything. But this is where the power of media lie. Verify details shared to question authority. And think of that, the weapons of mass destruction I mentioned. If the media had done its job of verifying the truth or questioning authority, I think we would have a different story. And so let us not question why there. So this is the part that if any blogger or any media entity, Politico, for example, Politico was not there 20 years ago. They came up with some of these ideas. And in the sense that if you can do that, this is where the big target is. This is the target in the CNN newsroom. This is the target in any good newsroom. And so, so do you want me to share my conclusion, or you want me to go a little bit further? What do you want to do? How much time do we have? We are good? Okay, great. So I have this lesson which I'll come to back at, so I was almost ready to say thank you to you. But I have another little thing I wanted to share with you, which is, you remember we mentioned about the visual. You know, journalism schools have been good at stressing on the verbal. Law schools have been good at stressing on the verbal. Business schools have been good at stressing on the verbal. But today, in today's days, we have to also consider the visual. And I'll give you an example, which is optics, right? Bill Sapphire in 2009 talked about optics, and then Zimmer, both are word experts, talk about image making. So I'll give you two examples of optics. Well, this is elementary, right? Kevin had second thoughts about going on that Sunday to take pictures, but he just saw the governor's schedule and found out that the governor's schedule was empty, and on a whim, he called the pilot and said, "Hey, do you want to just take a shot?" And they took a shot, and it was a real shot. But think of the memes. So at 12:41, this is Chris Christie, Governor Chris Christie. 3:18, I did not get any sun, and then the memes start. Right? So think of public relations. Not a word has been shared, and of course these are multiple instances, right? Combined in one picture. So think of the power of that visual. This is a cartoon, of course, Steve Sack. And that dog is special. The name of that dog is Watchdog. So there's another question. My presentation is riddled with questions, some of which I do not have an answer. And if I had an answer, I would have a job in Wall Street and things like that. But think of that. High quality intellectual content in simple language and in oral forms. You know, all that, some of the things that I shared with you kind of signify that. But if you were to ask me which are some of these entities, some of them are right here. And you use them and you thrive on them. And of course, this is not the only list I have. I notice on the bottom panel, I included a lot of logos of people who were doing journalism, discussing the profession of journalism. And I encourage all of us to go through that. But I wanted to take a total turn and share with you the power of what is happening in the corporate world. So you remember this, right? If you don't remember, I'm reminding you with this bad visual. Can anybody tell me what did Tic Tac do? I have three questions. If you were the PR outfit for Tic Tac, what would you do? Would you just keep quiet, let it lie on the floor? Would you respond? Quick. They responded. Great answer. And this was the response. So think of that in terms of time. This happened October 7, 2016. I mean, this really didn't happen October 7th, but it was revealed. By October 8, Tic Tac came up with it. And it says, I think this is very relevant in this day and age. And of course, it happened in October. But you can realize what was going on in terms of the response, which was, I think a lot of people thought. Another example, Donald Trump compared. Can anybody tell me what happened? What did Skittles do? Skittles responded too. Because and it responded within hours. Skittles are candy, refugees are people. But I would like you to draw your attention to one word. So when I moved to the South from Ohio, people told me one thing, that in the South, if you want to say something like very strong to someone, you say, bless your heart, and you can say anything. I don't know if that's true, but I never tried it. But I say in the world of statements, if you want to say, I respectfully say something, you are protected. And that's what Mars did. Mars, as you know, is a big power candy house. Last month,
for Halloween, I bet you use some of Mars products. I mean, they pitch Halloween in a big way. The third example, Donald Trump loves McDonald's. Or I don't know if he loves it, but he's associated with McDonald's. And then one morning, so this is 2016, he's celebrating his candidacy, which got established that day, with this little. But one morning, which was this year, can you tell me what happened? So some employee was having a bad morning or a good morning. So there is another interesting thing. 21st January 2017, Donald Trump's become president of the US, would be sworn in. This is the front page of a newspaper in India, and not any newspaper in India, the Times of India, which is among the largest newspapers in the world, period. Now, do you notice this? Can you tell me what is going on here? Newspapers in India now have this routinely, that they have what they call a cover, in the sense that this is basically a cover. So it has Times of India, but it has an ad. And last time we tried it in this country, it was the LA Times promoting Alice in Wonderland, and it was a disaster because people started protesting. But sometimes, so this, I just wanted to share that with you. So this was an ad with Devika Saraf. They manufacture television. They have outfits in the US and in India, and so it was promoted. This is a radio station. Who does Trump remind you of, apart from Trump? David Bowie. They did not get it right. The Aladdin Sane, and they did not get the tear. Of course, they did not. But this was a radio station just in this year promoting that. This was a print ad in Paraguay. So our president is being depicted in all sorts of ways, and they don't have to pay a dime to our president because he is a public figure who could be featured in ads. So very quickly, there are little things that have happened, like at Hamburg. Do any of you know what Fritz Cola is? It's like Snapple with an attitude. So Fritz Cola, founded by two brothers, they were the G20 summit was meeting in Germany. I'll finish up in 2 minutes. Meeting up in Germany, and they had this. So the people of Germany were not too happy, and so they had a whole campaign which they met. So think of that. Today, when you wanted to state a message, you don't have to be a journalist to do that. You can be an advertising person to do that. And that's what they did. Does anybody recognize this person? Okay, Putin. Of course, I had it just to make sure that we had the right person. The president of Turkey. And then, this is where I will end. This was a tea company promoting in 2016 their brand of tea from India.
You came all the way from India to do what?
Donald Trump has got the whole world worried. Mexicans, Muslims, Jews, blacks, women, immigrants, gays, Democrats, hell, even Republicans. We can't stop him, but maybe we can change him. A tea company from India decided to deliver 4 years worth of goodness straight to Trump Tower in New York City. With a message.
Dear Mr. Trump, Namaste from India. We're sending you lots and lots of natural green tea. mind and body, and regain a healthy balance. It's also proven to make people smarter. Please, Mr. Trump, drink the tea. For your sake, for America's sake, for the world's sake. Drink the tea, because it's never too late to cleanse yourself.
Okay, and it goes on for 1 minute. Okay, thank you. You have been very patient. Let's do questions.
Awesome, awesome. Questions? Questions? You've had a couple here. Somebody else here? And I'll get back to you if nobody else has a question here. Okay.
So you spoke about disintermediation a lot. Do you see any parallels between what happened with the Gutenberg Press in terms of opening the sources of information and what the internet has done? And do you see similar consequences coming from that dissemination of information?
In fact, that's a very relevant question, because a lot of people would talk about Gutenberg disrupting, right? Disruption is something that you have heard. And Gutenberg, you can use disruption for anything that is happening. The iPhone disrupted a lot of newspapers or a lot of news entities. But disintermediation kind of reflects that there is not a replacement, but there is a new orientation. We are still accessing information. Gutenberg did the same thing. Knowledge was there, except that it was not printed. And so Gutenberg, actually, he was a goldsmith. He had an interest in printing, and one of the things that not a lot of people know is that Gutenberg, when he did his printing press, he did the Bible and other things. But another important thing was Thomas Caxton traveled from England to Germany to learn the printing process, and Caxton was the big publisher in England. He published a series of books, including Canterbury Tales. So the short answer to your nice question is yes, and you can find these disintermediation related to a lot of trends that have happened. And the other thing that I learned was reintermediation, which I shared with you. But there is counter-intermediation, like Samsung coming up with another brand of a watch. I mean, I'm just trying to stay on watch. You can draw it into any media things or anything that we do in our real lives. Thank you.
Okay, right here.
Referring to that slide you had with the puppy pulling down Chris Christie's swimming trunks, you mentioned the significance of the dog, but there's the whole picture is reminiscent of the old Coppertone suntan lotion billboards. Now, I'm wondering if that's a subtle way of trying to bring the older generation to connect with the new optics that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think you make a very relevant point. I mean, the more important than that cartoon, I bet you a lot of people just forwarded it as a cute cartoon. I mean, and I'll give you another question. You know, you saw Sarah Palin being depicted by Tina Fey, right? Let me ask you a good question. I don't know if it's a good question, depends on your answer. How many of you watched Tina Fey do impressions of Sarah Palin on Saturday, on night and live? Okay, no, I mean, not online. I mean on Saturday night and live. So all the people who have raised their hands are rabid Saturday Night Live fans. The rest of us, where did you watch it? You watched it online or YouTube, and you may watch it next. So we are getting to an entity where if there is quality media content, you will have an extra life, which is exciting. I mean, think of that, you know, Tina Fey's impressions are now part of lore. Cultural road, our nation's cultural road, if I can say that right. So you can understand, and it was great to hear the history of how presidents have been transformed as our first presentation, but I think it's amazing how the visual part has become a very prominent aspect of what we do.
We have a couple people who have questions here. I want a very quick question here. Are we in danger sometimes of trying to make messages out of messages that really don't have one, that wasn't intended to be a certain message?
Yes, of course. There's always that unintended reward. That
overthinking, huh? There you go.
Your topic was who is a journalist, with this disintermediation, you would then argue that everyone is a journalist, whether they've had any sort of background in fairness, anything?
I would share this slide as my answer. In today's day and age, I mean, you have heard this before, we do not want to categorize people. So anybody who wants to be successful in our world, and especially younger people, you have to do all of these. And you have to do it because these are important things for our life. So, you know, the average employer doesn't worry about if you went into a PR sequence or an advertising sequence, or you were in journalism. I mean, quite honestly, some of those walls have collapsed. So the journalist is also promoting things. So these are my 7 tips that I would share. And that relates to a very important thing. Today, we are looking at good communicators. Now, some people would trend to be in journalism, the real journalism, but these walls have become very low. So you cannot just categorize in one area. So I would suggest this. And you would say data journalism is not in there. Data journalism is behind everything because data is kind of defining a lot of the decisions.
Last question.
What makes you feel optimistic about the future?
Good question. What makes you feel pessimistic about that? I have nothing to be, you know, I mean, didn't Truman said we had nothing to fear but fear itself? I think, look at how vibrant this situation has been. Look at how there are non-journalistic entities contributing to the news. And this is just not happening now. I mentioned George Bush. You know, in the 2004 campaign, Dan Rather released that whole thing. I mean, Dan Rather did not do that. It was a CBS team. And I think the thing that they did was look at these documents online. And somebody who was a typewriter expert looked at that document and said, hey, this is crazy. Now, I had a little laugh about it this summer because the Prime Minister of Pakistan lost his job for the same reason, proving that history repeats itself. So what happened, the Pakistan Prime Minister was asked by the Supreme Court judges to justify his assets. And Pakistan's Prime Minister's daughter, I guess she's not very smart, she came up with a list where she used the Calibri font. I know you all use Calibri font, but apparently Calibri font was not there 15 years ago. And so it was a made-up document. So think of that. So there is hope. And I would be lying if we do not have that kind of so it's not that I'm not Pollyannish about it. I really feel it's become more vibrant, but some of the things that I mentioned were based on data. And I think you would all agree to that you know, wouldn't you enjoy a good advertising? Would you look at that advertising and say, wait a minute, that's not by a journalist, I'm not going to read it. So I think I'm very optimistic. So I guess I answered your question with a question. I don't know if you're happy about that, but
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please. Thank you very much. Water and coffee in the lobby, and Mr. Lyle Denniston coming up at the top of the hour. So thanks.
Thank you. You did a great job. I appreciate it. I guess.
Now, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go over to our next presenter. So I'll just seek your attention, if you don't mind, at this point in time. So I'm very pleased to have the honor of introducing Lyle Denniston, who is contributing writer for the Constitution Daily. Lyle writes, as I said, for the Constitution Daily, a National Constitution Centre blog. He has spent 58 years reporting on the Supreme Court for the Constitution Centre, his own blog and SCOTUS blog, which is an online clearinghouse for information about the Supreme Court's work. During his time as a reporter, Lyle covered 1/4 of all the justices ever to sit on the Supreme Court. I believe that was 31 out of the 113 justices, according to Wikipedia. I just asked Lyle to verify that, and he said, I always say 1/4. He started his career in 1949 at the Otoe County Courthouse in Nebraska City, Nebraska. And one of the questions that somebody in the audience should ask him at the end of this is about his very first story. It will give a lie to what Deb Acott said a while ago about a 40-year-old being a youngster. Lyle graduated from the University of Nebraska with a degree in journalism and graduated with a Master of Arts degree from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. It is my great pleasure to introduce Lyle to you. As I said to him a few minutes ago, I think he is an inimitable, cogent speaker and a man who has a marvelous facility with words, with stories, with facts, and who has a great value to us at this university and indeed at any university nationally or internationally. So over to Lyle.
Thank you, Dean Marin. I want to make sure at the outset that you can hear me. Can you in the back? When I was in the high school choir in Nebraska City, we had a choir director named Miss Peterson. And during practice, every now and then, she would stop and she would say, "Can we try it again without Lyle?" So I learned humility at a very early age. It is a joy and a pleasure always for me to come back to Nebraska, and I was absolutely surprised and delighted to discover the plaque on the back of the wall of this room that the room was dedicated to and no doubt funded by Joe Sechrist. Joe was my publisher at the Lincoln Journal when I was a reporter there. And I was absolutely delighted when Pamela and I opened the curtains in our hotel room to discover that we were right across the street from the Journal-Star building. It's always a bit jarring for me to see the words Journal and Star together. The Journal and the Star in my day there were really deeply and almost angrily competitive. The Journal was the afternoon paper, the Star was the morning paper, and quite literally, ladies and gentlemen, it was a firing offense if you were found in the other newsroom. Because we really thought, we at the Journal thought the Star was a very bad newspaper, but it was a very good competitor. And so we took that competition seriously. I'm also honored to discover that the honor paid to me 2 years ago by the Nebraska Press Association and the college is one of the plaques on your wall here. I am dyed in the wool Nebraskan. The dye is a little faded now, I think, particularly on Saturday afternoons, but I'm awaiting the arrival of a new coach. I don't suppose that's impolitic to say before the season is over, but I do follow the football team. I wish I were as loyal to basketball and volleyball, but in Nebraska, we have a wonderful tradition among Nebraskans that we speak very proudly of our college and our state. And a couple of years ago, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, I won't name drop in order to flatter myself, called me up and said, I'm going to Nebraska and I want to make a speech. And can you give me some Nebraska humor? And so I said to him, well, I have a book on my shelf that's a very thin book. Some of you may know it. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from here. It's a delightful collection of Nebraska humor. So I told him this story, and I'm sure you have heard it over and over again. On a Saturday afternoon in Memorial Stadium, there was one empty seat way up high on the east side of the stadium. And next to that stadium on one side was an elderly woman. And a gentleman was on the other side of that empty seat. And he turned over and he says, "Do you know whose seat that is?" And she says, "Yes, that's my husband's." And he said, "Well, couldn't you get someone else to come to see the game today?" And she said, "Oh my, no, they are all at his funeral today." Which, well, I told that story to my friend on the court. And about 3 months later, I went out to Lawrence, Kansas to speak at the law school. And my sponsor took me out to dinner, and he said, "You know, Justice X was here last week, and he told this incredible story about Fog Allen Arena." And Lawrence, of course, is much better known for basketball than it is for football. So I said, "Oh, what was that story?" And he said, "Well, high up in the bleachers." So I assume Kansans are as proud of their Jayhawk teams as I am of our Cornhuskers through thick and thin. You've had just a moment ago a really dynamic speaker. And if Deb kind of wore you out, I wouldn't mind at all if you took the next 45 minutes to have a little nap. I'm about as modern in my technology as a cell phone that I use only for making calls. So I do not have a display for you, but I want you to know this is a three-dimensional media presentation. I wrote out my speech. I'm going to speak it, and you're going to listen. So in that dimension, it is as modern as it could be. But I do want to turn serious because it's a topic, by the way, that I would have probably discussed with you had I come to the first conference that Dean Marin and her staff arranged about fake news, because I do want to talk to you, and it's appropriate both when we're talking about modern journalism and also when we're talking about the impact of the Trump era on American media. But what I'm going to talk about in particular is a very specific question, the question of whether the First Amendment to the Constitution and the phenomenon of fake media can coexist. The answer, I'll give it to you in front, is yes, indeed, they can coexist. They must coexist, or if one is to give way to the other, fake media has got to give way to free expression. But when I begin my talk about this subject, I want to focus first on the ultimate question of truth versus falsity. My wife, Pamela, who reads much more widely than I do, has given me a quotation to start my lecture. It's from the futuristic novel Dune. If you haven't read it, I'm told by my wife that it's a fantastic exegesis on what life would be like in the interstellar future. But at one point, the main character in Dune says to a chronicler, "My father once told me that respect for the truth comes close to being the basis for all morality." And the speaker then goes on to say, "This is profound thinking if you understand how unstable truth can be." In this day of Trumpian leadership in Washington, I use that phrase somewhat loosely. In this day of Trump leadership in Washington, truth is very unstable much of the time. But there was another time in our history, going from the future back to the past, when truth was honored, deeply honored, and that was, of course, in 1776, when our founders spoke of truths that were self-evident. And one of those truths, of course, was that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. And it's my belief, and it has always been my belief, that self-government is totally impossible without reliably truthful information about matters that affect public policy. That generation knew very well that truth was essential to self-government. But every new generation has to discover for itself what truth is, or what truth ought to be understood to be. And we are always, always in search of truth. And we in journalism join our people of this country in searching for truth. But those of us who toil away in journalism on a daily basis remind ourselves of the solemn responsibility that we have to go with being a source for truth. We have told ourselves, and we do so with utmost sincerity, that we can be depended upon to deliver the truth, at least as best as we can discover it. That is what it means, it seems to me, to be part of the constitutionally privileged Fourth Estate. But we have lately found, and several other speakers today have pointed this out vividly to you, that as communicators to the public, we in journalism definitely are no longer alone. The digital age has come, and it has turned an audience that we had mostly to ourselves into companion journalists, creating their own audiences and writing pretty much as they please. They are brought to you in the billions with the word "be" through such platforms as Facebook and Twitter and myriad other platforms, none of which we knew about just a few years ago. And for our companion journalists writing in this country through the internet and via the internet, I would argue, though I know there are academics who dispute this, that those online communicators share with us the protection and the blessings of the First Amendment of our Constitution. Some of us, at least, remain confident that many of those online writers share our belief that the freedom we all are guaranteed is best served by not passing off as truthful what is known not to be true. Some scholars have looked down their noses at this new phenomenon and unfortunately have chosen to label it cheap speech, as if the utterances of the general public could not possibly rise to the nobility of commercial journalism. Well, it's my belief, ladies and gentlemen, that just because it is now inexpensive to set up an internet forum of your own does not mean that the organized news industry has a monopoly on useful and uplifting and, yes, truthful expression. However, we do know that there are those who communicate by these new digital forums what they themselves know to be false, and they propagate it intentionally to destabilize, in particular, America's political discourse. Just a few days ago, we were told by Facebook and Twitter that during the last national election campaign, ads appearing on those platforms and paid for by agents of Russia had ultimately reached, with sharing and copying taken into account, into the hundreds of millions of Americans. There is now a widely held belief, based upon quite reliable evidence, that much of that information was, quote, fake news, and that it, in fact, was targeted specifically to particular audiences of voters in order to have the maximum destabilizing effect. In short, if we consider only that one election campaign and only those two digital platforms among the many that are now operating, we can say with utmost confidence that our democracy has been threatened profoundly, and that the electoral choice that were made by Americans across this country has been put under a cloud of considerable uncertainty. We do not know, and I suggest to you that we may never know, whether the election of President Trump was in any way determined by or even somewhat influenced by that disinformation campaign. How could we know what was in the minds of millions of Americans as they closed the curtain, entered the polling booth, and cast their choice on their ballots?
We do know, however, that we proceed at our peril if we assume that no such direct effect was possible, or if we assume that it will not be possible in the next time we all go to the polls. We are faced, it seems to me, with an ultimate question of whether the political preferences of the American people can be expressed reliably without some way to neutralize, and I tell you, we cannot possibly eradicate completely fake news. It will be with us probably always. Now, it will take someone who has greater technological savvy than I do to explain to you just what happened and why it is likely to happen again, perhaps in all of our future elections. But one thing that I can say without hesitation or qualification is that this has put an enormous stress on the Constitution's First Amendment. If we believe, as I surely do, that the legitimacy of elections depends upon some assurance that the voters are informed, that their choice is based on something other than mere caprice or whim, that we have to ask ourselves whether the sources of political information any longer are genuinely dependable and reliably true. Jeffrey Stone, who teaches law at the University of Chicago, has reminded us, quote, "The First Amendment assumes the existence of a populace that is reasonably educated, thoughtful, responsible, and intelligent," unquote. If that is so, then I would ask, how do those of us who deliver political ideas, traditional and modern delivers, how do we best serve that population? It is by advancing public knowledge and understanding through truthful information so that truth has a chance to triumph over falsehood. As you may remember, if you read your history, that we were assured by John Milton and by Thomas Jefferson that truth would always win over falsehood in free and open combat. We do well to remember, by the way, that when the nation's press won an immense constitutional victory in the Supreme Court more than a half-century ago in a decision providing a strong shield against the silencing power of libel, that protection was made available to us only when the stories that the press sends out are not knowingly false. We have no First Amendment protection if we intentionally peddle untruths. If that is what the Constitution's First Amendment demands, what can we say now, today, of the vitality or even the usefulness of the First Amendment when its freedoms are deployed in the knowing dissemination of falsehood? There are those who today will tell us that the First Amendment has been sidelined in the digital age. Earlier this fall, a very well-respected law professor at Columbia University, Tim Wu, wrote a truly provocative essay for the Knight First Amendment Institute under the title, "Is the First Amendment Obsolete?" His primary focus is on political speech and the impact on it from what he calls the attention industry, which is a very clever phrase. What he means by the attention industry is a set of actors whose business model is the resale of human attention. Their goal, as he sees it, is exceedingly ambitious. Quote, "Every hour, indeed every second of our time, has commercial actors seeking to occupy it one way or the other," unquote. It is an intriguing and in many ways an unsettling view of today's information landscape. That landscape is very fertile ground, the professor suggests, for the growth of fake news. And he says that landscape presently exists outside of the norms that the First Amendment has historically sought to foster. Tim Wu, though, in the end of his essay, does not conclude that the First Amendment has become obsolete, and neither do I. After spending nearly 6 decades of watching the United States Supreme Court, I can tell you with firm assurance that the First Amendment remains very much alive in our constitutional republic. Although there are many modern precedents of the court suggesting that free expression remains robustly protected, one need look no further back than last June when the court decided a case named Packingham versus North Carolina. That case, as the court noted, was one of the first in which it would address the relationship between the First Amendment and the modern Internet. Very early in the lead opinion, which was written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, the court reminded the nation of what it called a fundamental principle of the First Amendment. Quote, that all persons have access to places where they can speak and listen, and then, after reflection, they can speak and listen once more, unquote. The court pronounced cyberspace as one of the most important places for the exchange of ideas. It talked of the vast democratic forums of the Internet, and almost with rhapsody in its literary voice, it said, the social media was bringing about a revolution in thought. All of that was a prelude to the actual decision that they made in that case, striking down as unconstitutional a North Carolina law that barred anyone who had been convicted of a sex crime from having access to any website that person should have known would be used by children. There are other ways to protect children from sexual predators, the court said, than imposing upon the people what it called a prohibition unprecedented in scope on human expression. We must understand, however, that is only the beginning of the answer on how the First Amendment applies, or maybe it does not apply, to the social media. The court addressed that relationship at this early stage only in the context of a law that swept so broadly that it was an almost perfect example of heavy-handed government regulation of the right to express and receive information and ideas. We do not know, ladies and gentlemen, from this point forward, where or even whether Internet expression will find a more or less settled place under the First Amendment. As we know from many past rulings, not all speech and not all expression lives under an undifferentiated interpretation of the First Amendment. Years ago, for example, the court allowed rather intrusive regulation of radio and television by concluding that, in a technical sense, that was a limited medium based on the perception that the broadcast spectrum existed only within narrow physical limits. Although everyone now knows that assumption is very much out of date, the spectrum can be divided and divided and divided again. And yet the court has never formally abandoned the idea that broadcasting is something of a second-class citizen under the umbrella of the First Amendment. The court has most often used the actual content of expression, that is, what is said or written, as the guide to the rank it will be assigned under the First Amendment. Among media of expression other than broadcast, the court simply denied First Amendment protection for what it believed did not have social value, such as pornography or obscenity. There was a time when it also said that First Amendment protections do not even apply to commercial expression, such as advertising. Later, it did change its mind on that somewhat when the promotion was involving something that the court deemed to have valuable social promise or use. And as I noted earlier, the court has found only modest protection for expression that is intentionally false. There was a decision 2 years ago in which the court provided First Amendment protection for an straightforward falsity. That was when a candidate for a local office in New Mexico falsely claimed that he had won, while in the military, the Medal of Honor. The court also has protected falsehood in other ways, but only when it has deemed that that was an excessive use of the government power to control expression. From the court's perspective, the most constitutionally entitled mode of expression is the political idea, the information that is, therefore, essential to self-government. The court has taken that view very far, so far indeed that the spending on money in politics is now endowed as protected political speech. In other words, in politics, money talks, and it does so with First Amendment protection. At this point, then, in our progress through this topic, we confront the very strong and important First Amendment question: will that promise of freedom and potential limitation on that freedom apply to the vast platforms of social media like Facebook and Twitter and Google because of the content that they offer on their platforms? The court's decision in the Pakenham case, I would suggest to you, does suggest that maybe the answer to that is yes, up to a point. Justice Kennedy wrote with undisguised admiration then about the cultural promise of the internet. And he was indeed talking about the contents of that media, not the modes by which it delivers its content. Even so, I do believe that it's quite possible, and I am sure that some of the current executives in Silicon Valley seem to be deeply worried about this, that social media's First Amendment freedom may be curtailed on the premise that the platform itself is the problem, that it has become such an overwhelming cultural behemoth that it cannot be trusted to regulate itself, and perhaps has grown so big that it could not regulate itself even if it tried to do so. The implication of that, of course, is that the time may have come for the government to step in. As Senator Dianne Feinstein of California told lawyers for the three social giants during congressional hearings just last week, quote, "You've created these platforms and now they are being misused. And you have to be the ones to do something about it, or we will." Unquote. If in reality platforms are only a conduit for other people's ideas and not their own, are they not just another kind of public utility? In fact, some observers have suggested that Facebook, for example, be forced to become a public benefit corporation, giving up entirely the pursuit of profits and be forced to become thoroughly accountable publicly. No one questions, I think, that we need the government to regulate the necessities of daily living, like water and energy and light. Does it make sense then? I think it may. To question the need for government regulation, it may not be important and essential to question that. And maybe such regulation should be rigorous indeed, of a platform that 7 out of every 10 Americans depend upon for personal communications and the source of the ideas that enrich or decline the value of their lives, especially political ideas. Recently, on a cable television broadcast, there was a truly remarkable comment by a person who is truly knowledgeable about media technology. Kara Switcher, who is an executive editor of Recode, which is an online journal that focuses on social media and its technology, she said this: "Twitter and other social media platforms are like cities. They are responsible for what goes on in their communities. They are not just neutral media platforms. If, as it seems to be beyond debate, those platforms are delivering a great deal of fake news, especially fake news of the political kind, to many millions of Americans, does the Constitution allow the government to protect the people from that corrupted flow? If the water company allowed harmful chemicals to flow into people's faucets, should the government be empowered to do something about that? I suggest that we have the answer to that question. Just ask the people of Flint, Michigan, what their thoughts are. But that is precisely, ladies and gentlemen, the nub of the constitutional conversation we are now having about fake news, at least as that form of information is supplied to such a vast audience by social media giants. It is the very nature of such information that it is fake, that in some definition of that word, it is fake, it is false. Then that supposedly summons the government to put on its regulatory hard hat and go to work. When we look into the problem beyond the fake news that is emerging from those platforms, we discover that we are looking at some very sophisticated techniques of science and mathematics. Technology at its very most inventive. How did the Russian propaganda machine reach its intended audience in the American electorate last year? It did so because engineers, or maybe it was just a group of automatons, took the personal information that social media users had freely supplied and ran it through algorithmic sorters and came up with targeted audiences. This is the result of the process that Facebook, for example, calls engagement. Let us know what you like, and we will supply to you what you like, and we will put you in touch with other people who like the same things that you do. Voila. Communities of interest magically come into being, ripe for the targeting with the expectation and intention that the messages will go viral and infect all members of the communities that receive them. So then, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the question we must ask ourselves. Is there something about the new media platforms themselves, something in their very nature, not because they are limited as broadcast media are, but precisely because they are so unlimited, with enormous power to shift perceptions of reality itself? Does that suggest the importance and value, the social value of some form of regulation? There are indeed observers of the technology industry who are far from optimistic about whether the social media can be regulated effectively, no matter how you would do it. For example, Patrick Ruffini, who is an executive of the research firm Echelon Insights, wrote last week in a Washington Post column analyzing the effect of Russian social media advertising. Quote, short of an upheaval significantly curtailing the use of social media as a vehicle for free expression, no legislation can prevent their use as vectors for misinformation or propaganda from foreign powers, particularly when social media is largely free and open for anyone to use, unquote. But let us assume, at least for the sake of argument, that some form of government regulation consistent with the First Amendment could be devised. We then must ask ourselves, how comfortable would we be having the government write those rules for us? The very idea is chilling, because the government itself is not a neutral entity. It is inhabited by people who, elected or not, are motivated by a political agenda, by values and ideologies that are not necessarily furthered by truth. Recall what we have been witnessing in Washington for much of the past year. President Trump and his government have been fomenting hostility to the press for publishing unwanted stories pressuring private parties such as the National Football League to prohibit unwarranted speech and punish White House critics, limiting who can attend press conferences and ask questions at those press conferences, blocking public access to government-collected media, or preventing the collection of data in the first place, and selectively responding to congressional inquiry. Most of us can understand, therefore, some of the anxiety that now is sweeping Silicon Valley, as that enterprise contemplates government interference with their control of the content that they generate and the delivery systems that they use. But even they do seem to have begun to accept some responsibility for making what they do more transparent than it now is. They may even be willing, it seems, to accept some government compulsion of transparency. And if the government's role were no greater than that, it might well be tolerable under the First Amendment as we understand it. That understanding lies behind the proposed legislation just introduced in both houses of Congress. Its intent is clear from its title, the Honest Ads Act. It proclaims, quote, that it is the sense of Congress that the dramatic increase in digital political advertisements and the growing centrality of online platforms in the lives of Americans requires the Congress and the Federal Election Commission to take meaningful action to ensure that laws and regulations provide the accountability and transparency that is fundamental to our democracy, unquote. Focusing for a moment only on paid advertising, the proposal would extend to the internet some of the restrictions that campaign finance law now applies to television and radio commercials at the height of political campaigns, what the law calls electioneering communications. The proposed legislation is very clever from a constitutional perspective. It focuses heavily upon disclosure requirements. Under this approach, according to the bill, an online platform with 50 million or more unique viewers in this country would have to create a database, searchable by the public, of political ads that were bought by anyone who spends more than $500 in 1 year. Included in the public file would be the text and images of the ad, information on the audience it was intended to target, the number of times it was viewed, when it appeared by day and time, what it cost, and how one contacts the person who bought that ad. It is clear, ladies and gentlemen, in the field of political expression, that the Supreme Court, even when it has been most generous in providing First Amendment protection, has always been willing to tolerate at least some compelled disclosure. The theory is that disclosure provides additional useful information, and more speech, at least in this context, can be better than less. In fact, the Supreme Court regularly refuses to hear cases in which some political activist or organization has raised a First Amendment challenge to compel disclosure about campaign spending. The justices seem simply not to have seen that as a problem. I could find quickly for you a dozen times that people have asked this court to review the constitutionality of restrictions of this kind, and the court has regularly refused even to get involved. The new legislative idea, of course, operates on the assumption that having to reveal the sources of political messaging is a workable remedy. But for that to be truly useful, in real-world terms, there must be diligent and sophisticated monitors of the information that is disclosed. In short, it will not help if nobody notices. I have spent so much time in these remarks on the First Amendment and the social media because I am convinced that that is where the most significant problem of fake news now exists. I am far from persuaded, however, that no matter what the president and his spokesman say, traditional journalism is a significant source of fake news. I do not see it, no matter how you define that phrase. I am incredibly impressed as a citizen as well as a journalist at what major news organizations in print and in broadcast, and some online too, have been able to force into the open about the disinformation that occurred during the last presidential campaign. Our online partners, I quickly say, have had their share. To me, this has been a golden year for investigative journalism. So I do not sense a threat genuine in character to the First Amendment freedom of traditional news organizations. They have come through some quite threatening environments in the past, and though there may be more noise in the current environment, I have difficulty believing that it will translate into a new age or new period of censorship or regulation of print and broadcast journalism. Being labeled an enemy of the people, in my perception, has no more power to it than a schoolyard taunt. I will confess, though, that I do have some worry about some trends that I see developing in traditional journalism today. Trends that I sense are contributing to a decline in trust among our readers and our listeners. Let me suggest a few of these briefly before I finish. First, the public has come to have increasing skepticism about news organizations' reliance upon unnamed sources. And I think we have sometimes lapsed in our duty to tell our readers and listeners as much as we possibly can about where we get our information, even as we do shield our sources. It is not enough, I think, to simply say that a source, quote, insisted upon confidentiality in order to reveal private information, unquote, or insisted on confidentiality in order to speak candidly, unquote. I think we have to find more explicit ways to describe our sources so that the public has some added basis for judging whether to believe what those sources have told us. It is simple laziness, ladies and gentlemen, to be satisfied with the mere claim that we have to keep them secret. In addition, my own perception is that no news story should ever be published where there is only a single source. Second, I think that in our political coverage, and especially in our coverage of scandal as an issue in political life, we have too often engaged in a false equivalence of misconduct. I believe that we need to do more, maybe much more, to keep an audience focused on each scandal as it develops. We should not feel obliged to balance our coverage of one scandal as if each was of equal venality or public consequence. Dirty tricks in politics is in reality different in kind and in degree. Third, I believe that we need to be more open with our readers and our listeners about our editorial policies. These need to be displayed in a prominent place. That would probably be best on our websites with a link to it when we publish and broadcast stories. Occasionally, we should give news coverage about our methods and values, how we do our work, and certainly to have full publicity and immediate publicity to our misdeeds as soon as they occur. Fourth, in discussing any act of government, I believe that our news and feature coverage should, with very few exceptions, provide an internet link to the documents upon which we have relied. I do not have the illusion that the readers and listeners will regularly follow up on their own, but I believe we must give them the option. It does not interfere one whit with our editorial independence to test whether our readers will see it the same way as we do. Give them the documents, they have the capacity to read them. Fifth, And my final point on this. I have noticed a rather alarming increase in reporters using Twitter and appearing on television to utter their own subjective value judgments about things that they are covering. Sometimes these border on the snide, but even if they are kindly in nature, this editorializing by journalists, by reporters, if we can call it that, just has to stop. I once had an editor, when I was with the Wall Street Journal, who said that the readers can find out what you think for 50 cents a day by buying our newspaper. Let me close these remarks, and I'm happy to see I've left a few moments for you, by saying that conferences like this very one should occur as often as our hosts can put them together. The American public has a right to know a great deal about us in the media, and if what they learn is as positive as it ought to be, perhaps some of our professional values, the values that we in journalism cherish, will rub off on the digital age's citizen journalists. We can hope, can't we? Thank you very much. I will not trench on the next person's time if we take some time for questions or responses. I do not assume that whenever you say something that there's a question mark at the end. So please share with me what's on your mind.
Thank you very much, Lyle, for a great talk. Amazing for its breadth and its depth. And I'll go over to this person who has a question.
You spoke about equivalating different news stories, scandals, in the name of trying to be fair and neutral. Is it your opinion that the Clinton email story was unfairly equivocated? And are there other examples where you see that two different scandals are made to seem equivalent when they in fact were not?
Well, I think the Clinton email scandal, treated as scandal, was the primary example of that, where media, in the interest of balance, and I don't question the ethical motivation. The ethical motivation, at least among traditional journalists, is that we must provide our readers with balance. But balance can come not only in the context of comparing unlikes. It can come in analyzing more deeply each form of misconduct, to take it on its merits and judge that against some objective standard. But there are other vices in contemporary journalism, it seems to me, that come under the general rubric of false equivalence. That is treating everything, for example, that a presidential candidate says with equal force. There are times we in journalism make editorial judgments all the time. And they are value judgments which we hope are informed by defensible professional values of good and evil. But when we apply a uniform standard of what is good or evil to every example of misconduct in society, I think we do our readers and our listeners an extreme disfavor. But I think you're right. The classic example this past year has been comparing the email vices, if there were vices, or vices such as they were, to all of the problems on the other side of the political equation. In the back.
Yeah. What is the effect on the court or judges, in your experience, when they are criticized by presidents, political candidates, or when they make a judgment that so-and-so deserves the death penalty?
The justices there are three forms of discipline that a judge in the American system live under and must abide. The American legal order is arranged so that it proceeds based upon authority. In other words, based upon precedent most of the time. You cannot simply write new law through the medium of judging existing law. You are always limited in the range of discretion you have by the fact of what precedent has said to you. A second discipline, which is always operating, is that you must stay within the record that is made by the lawyers and the lower courts before you when you're on the Supreme Court. You cannot create new facts. You cannot create new interpretations legally of existing facts. You must take the facts as they are given. And the third discipline that you learn when you're in a judicial position, particularly on a court like the Supreme Court and other courts where you have colleagues who share your authority, you must be able to articulate rational and convincing reasons for judgment. Those three disciplines, I will tell you, are onerous. You can sometimes downplay them. You can sometimes indeed evade them altogether, but you cannot do it routinely. There is a discipline to being a judge. And when people come through the process of examination by the approving authority, the Senate for federal judges, they do not lose the reality that when they become judges, life will be different. There is something that happens when you put on a robe. If it doesn't happen, we have a remedy for that, which is impeachment. But there is a discipline in being a judge, which I think is a source of profound reassurance to the American people. That when you put people on the Supreme Court, they will, and on lower courts as well, they will behave within the limits of what the judicial craft allows. Now, that is not to say that there is no place for subjective value systems. Not one of us in humankind can take all of the accumulation of values that we grow up with or develop and set them aside. We in journalism pride ourselves on the notion that we can take some of our values and put them aside, but we don't really put them aside. We submerge them. We intentionally submerge them. Judges do the same sort of thing. Now, that does not mean that all 9 judges who sit at any time have the same value system. They don't. So you will see division within the court. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you in 2017, and I've been watching that place since 1958, you can trust your Supreme Court. You can also trust your lower courts because they live within a disciplined environment. You may not like what they do, but I'm telling you, you really owe it to yourselves to respect the process. I'm a real believer in it. As a matter of fact, I'm such a believer in it that if you want me to take the time to do it, and I won't, I will tell you why Bush versus Gore came out the right way. And I'm a liberal, progressive at heart. Anybody else have a question?
Any other questions?
Over here and then down here. Back here first, okay.
I'll hold it. You mentioned earlier some about the First Amendment and how the president has talked about football players taking a knee and asking owners to take some type of action, and even some censoring, if you will, of the media. We also discussed checks and balances of, our governments. What role do you think the Supreme Court has or will have in kind of limiting or kind of watching what may be seen as, I don't know, it seems like he's overstepping the bounds of what Americans can do with their First Amendment. Does that make sense at all?
Well, take it a little bit further and help me a little bit more understanding where you're going with that.
It seems like, as the President of the United States, you should be advocating for the expression of the First Amendment however Americans choose, but it seems like if it's contrary to his political ideas or his agenda, that he's condemning that in some type of way. And as the figure, the head of this country, what balances or what should be done or could be done to make sure that he stays in line with our Constitution? Does it make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
Okay.
All I will say to you, as a first point, is look at what the American press has done since Inauguration Day, particularly in institutions like the Washington Post and the New York Times and NBC and MSNBC. The press has fulfilled its function as a monitor of government in a magnificent way. If I were sitting on the Pulitzer Committee this year, I would not know how to make a choice because there has been such magnificent journalism. But I can tell you, frankly, those of us who grew up in journalism are not weak-kneed. We are not easily cowed. We are ornery bastards, really. And if you grow up in the tradition of journalism, of great journalists like those who were the muckraker, Ray Stannard Baker, and those at the same time. And we live out a daily tradition in journalism of toughness, of commitment to the truth. And tin horn politicians have come and gone, and we've outlasted all of them. And this fellow, we will outlast him as well. And it strikes me, he does have some levers of power that he can use against us. I mean, and his staff, when General Kelly got up in that press conference in the White House briefing room and decided who could ask questions of him who is paid with taxpayer money, decided who was qualified to ask him questions about public policy. That was an example of the power that they do have. They probably have power through the Federal Communications Commission, their appointees, to inhibit in some ways broadcast advertising. But we will find ways. We always find ways to get around the limitations that they undertake to put on us. So I don't want you to think that we see ourselves as gladiators. Sometimes when we put our heads down on the pillow and are having trouble going to sleep, we may think that we're really pretty good guys at what we do. But in a real sense, when you are in a newsroom, there is a humility about the place. There is the sense that we have an incredible obligation. You do not graduate with a degree in journalism and believe that you're going to save the world. You do graduate with the belief that you're going to inform the world. And there can be absolutely no higher calling. So this fellow is an interesting man. We will survive him. The American press will survive him. And I have a reasonable belief that the country will survive him. I think you had a question, and maybe this has to be the last one, so can we take... this young woman had a question down here.
I was wondering if you could tell us the story of your first...
All right. When I graduated from high school, no one in my family had ever gone to college, and we didn't have the money because there were 7 of us kids, and we were growing up in the Depression years. So going away to college was just lunacy. We couldn't possibly do it. But I had worked on the high school newspaper and they call it the high school yearbook, and so I had gotten an offer to become an apprentice machinist at the local ironworks, but the editor of the paper, who knew that I had been working in journalism in high school, called me up and said, would you like to be a journalist? And I said, well, isn't being a machinist a pretty good way to spend your lives? And he said, well, it probably pays better, but I think you will be more rewarded after what you've done in school being a journalist. So I was hired as a reporter for the Nebraska City News Press. And the very first story I covered was an automobile accident that occurred south of Nebraska City, where I was working. And my story began, the name is fictitious because that part I don't remember. Sam Brown, 43, and his wife, Eleanor, 41, were injured in an automobile accident south of the city last night. The elderly couple was taken to you know the rest of the story. At the time, my editor was a wonderful elderly gentleman named Hyde Sweet, who I think was 73 at the time. And he called me in and he laid that story down. It was typed on paper, of course, in those days. And he said, "How old are you, son?" I said, "I'm 17, sir." And he said, "I'm going to edit this for you, but learn your lesson. Do not put yourself in the story." And you do that when you use a frame of reference that gives you away. And so that's my very first story. I think I still have that clipping because my basement is filled with filing cabinets that I think have every news story I ever wrote. So it's going to go to some school. If University of Nebraska has an interest, I would entertain the request. So thank you so much for being such a wonderful.
Thank you very much, Lyle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I do have, yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay, folks, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Daniel Lippman. Daniel is a reporter for Politico and a co-author of Politico's Playbook. Before joining the team at Politico, he spent time covering environmental news for E&E Publishing and reporting for the Wall Street Journal in New York. He has travelled to the Turkish-Syrian border to cover the Syrian civil war for the Huffington Post and for CNN. Daniel graduated from the George Washington University in 2012. So over to Daniel.
Thank you. Sure. Thanks so much. It's my first time in Nebraska, so next time maybe I'll come when it's a little warmer. So I wanted to just speak for maybe 15, 20 minutes and then take some questions. And I thought I'd kind of touch on how I got my start in my career as a journalist, for students out there to, hear kind of a unique path. So I'm from Western Massachusetts, went to boarding school in Connecticut, and then went to college at George Washington. And ever since I was young, I was very interested in the news. And, I grew up during a time of kind of another administration in Washington that, attracted the hackles of liberals and Democrats during the Bush administration. And now everyone, thinks Bush is kind of an angel compared to Donald Trump. But back then they didn't. And so I had a kind of a front row seat in some ways because the Bush White House had something called Ask the White House, which was an online forum where anyone could ask questions. And when I was 14 years old, they would have senior advisors to the president, they had cabinet members in the Bush administration. And so when I was in high school, I just had one of my hobbies was to ask questions online, and so I asked maybe dozens of questions, and they'd always get answered because the Bush White House they wanted to show that young people were engaging with the administration, and so it was kind of a good news story, a rare one during the Iraq War and the various controversies for Bush, and so that got me a profile in the New Yorker and on CNN, and then in college, since I was so interested in the news, I would read lots of articles, and I would sometimes notice errors in stories and things that were wrong. And so I don't know how I got this idea, but I would email the reporter and tell them that I like their story, but there's something wrong, that they should fix it. So I did that thousands of times when I was in college. I was not a member of a fraternity, so that was kind of I was in my own little fraternity where I'd ask these questions, and I always would do it in a nice way, and that got me lots of contacts as in journalism. That also got me profiled by my current employer, Politico. And so every time I would apply for an internship at Politico, I'd send the profile that they had done of me, but they would never hire me until a couple of years ago. And so that led me to do lots of internships, and so I did I've never met someone who did more internships in journalism or temporary jobs. I did 9 throughout high school, college, and after college. 9 internships and temporary jobs that I wanted to turn into a permanent job, but never really did. And right now, my job is to co-write the Playbook newsletter, which they've passed out little sign-up cards. It's a free daily newsletter. It goes out to over 100,000 influencers in Washington and beyond. And to do my job, I wake up at about 3:30 a.m. every morning on weekdays with my 2 colleagues, Jake Sherman and Anna Palmer, and we in 2 hours we write kind of a tip sheet on how to start your day in DC. And maybe if someone else more boring was president, then I could wake up later because there would be less news. But so far Trump and I, we get up at the same time, so it's never been a more important time to be a journalist because the stakes are pretty high in terms of democracy, and so there is this sense of a crisis and chaos in the Capitol most of the time. People think that they are expecting that the three major adults in the room, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, H.R. McMaster, and maybe Rex Tillerson, that they would hold Trump to keep him restrained in case North Korea does something crazy. And so the mood in D.C. is pretty electric, and there's been stories about how there's this huge swarm of reporters on Capitol Hill right now, and there's always reporters on the Hill. It's that's where politicians are, but they've even had to hold meetings in Capitol Hill because to deal with the crowds of reporters. And so how do we manage this influx of journalists? And so there's hundreds of reporters credentialed, and they're prowling around asking senators and congressmen for quotes about what Trump did or what's going to happen on the Hill. And so we feel like we're watching history unfold. And during some other debates, most people don't remember that. And so remember when Bush in 2005, he tried to reform Social Security, and that went nowhere. That's not going to be written in the history books as much as what's happening right now with Trump. And so, some of the promises that the president has promised during the campaign or pledged, they haven't come true. And so I just talk about draining the swamp, for example, that he said that hundreds of times, and I went to some of his rallies and I would hear that, but the swamp is swampier than ever, and because companies and associations, they see this need to influence what Trump reads, and they want to know how to get to him, and so they're hiring Trump campaign lobbyists, or lobbyists who worked on the Trump campaign, and they're advertising on Fox and Friends and Morning Joe. So those ads rates have gone through the roof, and that's the billions of dollars are spent every year on lobbying, and so it doesn't. That's something that he really can't fix. And what I always find funny about this administration is that even though everyone thinks that Trump hates journalists and reporters, and he definitely says things that are not conducive to to democracy, basically. He actually loves the media and he loves the game, and so when he will call up Maggie Haberman and call up other journalists, he loves to bring reporters who write negative articles on him into the White House, and he'll take a picture smiling and with his thumbs up in the Oval Office for those reporters. And I remember one of my colleagues took a picture of that, and when a senior White House official heard about that, they were like, that's one of our enemies. We can't. Why are we taking pictures with him? And so you see this this conflict within different parts of the White House and also the administration. And the Trump administration people are frankly pretty different from most previous administration people. You had the case of the chief scientist at the Department of Agriculture who wasn't a scientist and was kind of a talk show radio host with a penchant for not telling the truth or just not having a good perspective on what he was his dealings with Russia. Which who would have thought that we're talking about USDA nominees who are dealing with the Russians or approving trips from the campaign, I wrote a piece a few months ago about how the Trump usually when a new administration comes to town, they will take out the society people in D.C. They will want to rub elbows. They want to, get invited to the cool parties, and you don't see that with the Trump administration people. They are pretty isolated. White House staffers will hold birthday parties, the young staffers, and only invite fellow White House staffers. And so it's a pretty it's an interesting experience when you feel like some of your friends don't look highly upon you if you work in the White House or the administration. But there are plenty of Democrats and others who think to themselves that if especially now, anyone good and smart and dedicated to public service, that's when you're needed most. Like, do you really want to leave the administration just to hiring people from Breitbart or people who believe in Steve Bannon? And so so you saw initially with the White House Communications Department, it was a haven for people who worked for the RNC because they were hired from Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer. And so other Trump people thought that it was not, why are we all hiring all these RNC people? They opposed us during the primary and kind of clandestinely, since they couldn't do it openly. Even after the Access Hollywood tape broke, the Reince Priebus came to Trump and was like, we should consider dropping out. And so they call that, Kellyanne Conway has it. She's talked about how it's the October 7th coalition, where if you stood by Trump after that tape broke, then you're like a loyalist. And if you didn't, then you're off the plane. So Chris Christie, he was kind of off the plane. That's why he didn't get, a good job in the administration. And that kind of talk of loyalty, which is, that's a huge obsession of Trump and Trump people. I remember hearing about a head of communications for a top agency, for a cabinet agency, and that person had said anti-Trump stuff on TV a few times and had anti-Trump tweets, and so that person had to go to, she was cleared by the Reince Priebus, or she was cleared by the person that she was going to work for, and then Sean Spicer rejected her, and so then her boss had to go to Reince Priebus, and he said to him, "I really want her. Can you make this happen?" And Reince said, "Sure, but we need to get the boss's approval for this, comms person in an agency, so not in the White House." And that's unprecedented for that level of scrutiny. And so then she had to go to the White House and had to basically, prostrate herself in front of Trump and say, and Trump had just like this piece of paper, he read her the anti-Trump tweets that she had said, and the stuff that she had said on TV too, and so she had to listen to him saying that, the President of the United States, and basically say, "I'm so sorry, I'm on your team now, I'll always be loyal." And so can you imagine like George W. Bush or Barack Obama doing that? It's unimaginable. And so then she finally got the job. He liked her, but that's kind of an extreme example of the loyalty that is demanded in this White House. And that means that people who are not loyal or were not supportive during the primary, during the general election, they're off the team. They're not. They don't want to work in the administration, and they're not getting hired. And so you see that's one of the reasons why there's fewer people who are taking have taken jobs. There are so many empty desks in the State Department, and even at the Education Department, they're just laying off people. Like hundreds of people are leaving because they don't want to. Education is not a priority in terms of the Education Department, and so that's kind of a unique thing that you don't see in most administrations. And I think, but Democrats, they feel pretty good about how the administration has gone because, I know Democrats are supposed to be, patriotic and loyal, and they want the country to do well. But every time Trump says something bad, then they basically are celebrating, because if he had a very successful administration, it'd be much harder for them to take control of, in the midterms, and in 2020. But there are some Democrats in the White House even. So like Jared and Ivanka and Gary Cohn, and that's a pretty unprecedented thing. Imagine if Obama had hired, hire people and top senior advisors of the Republican Party. It was already. Democrats were already kind of pissed at him that he kept Robert Gates on, a Republican, as Secretary of Defense, which is kind of a nonpartisan post, and everyone thought that Gates did a great job, but I don't know how many people would say that about Ivanka and Jared. Like, what have they accomplished? And this year it seems like the Middle East is in chaos, and Trump is now currying favor with the Chinese, which is kind of which is an example of how whatever you thought Trump does, he will do the opposite tomorrow or next week. But one thing that hasn't changed is how how much he lies, and that's more of a fact. It's not an opinion. During the campaign, which I covered, I watched for a whole week in March and in September of every speech and rally he did, and counted up and categorized all of the different misstatements and lies and things that he said that were wrong, and it came to once every 5 minutes over 4.5 hours, and in March, and then in September it was one every 3 minutes. So every 180 seconds there was something that he said that was factually inaccurate. And so, he can rail against the, lies of the fake media, but it would probably be better if he was more factual, and it would help him too. And so I think some of his supporters too don't like the fact that they can't trust what he says, and it undermines his credibility and his agenda in terms of getting things done. I remember, since I wake up so early, I remember kind of a funny story. Right after my first story came out about the misstatements, President Obama mentioned the story at a journalism awards dinner, and I had fallen asleep right as he was speaking, but a minute before he mentioned my story, I woke up and I could hear him praise my story, which was nice. So I would have kicked myself forever if I had the one time that a president mentions your story, you're fast asleep 100 feet away. So my parents would not be happy with me. But I think for people who want to be journalists, it's not the easiest to get into the profession, but there's nothing better than going to work every day and being enthusiastic about covering politics or covering news. And so my message to you would be keep the faith that you will get a job, but you basically have to find a foot in the door where you can be the best intern that a newsroom has ever seen, or you have to make yourself essential. And so because journalists who are not essential, there's lots of other people who are eager to do that job, and they would happily take your place. And so my way is when I was trying to break in was just to email reporters, and not even you don't have to copy my method of just tweaking their accuracy. You could just say hey, I admire your work, I'd love to get coffee or go get a phone call with you and hear about your career, because people love to talk about themselves and people love to help each other. And so, and especially with journalists, so it's kind of a it's a tight-knit group. Everyone knows each other, and people are eager to, journalists like me and Rick Klein and others, we want to have a strong core of journalists who are coming after us and who are in the younger generation, because the newsroom can't thrive if you're not attracting young people. And so, especially at Politica, we started with 35 employees 10 years ago. Now we're at 500, and it's a global publications. We have Politica Europe. We have now state playbooks in Florida, California, New Jersey, New York, other places. And so, that's an example of a publication that is, we're niche, but we're also, most people who pay attention to politics and media, they know who we are, and we're linked on Drudge, and there's 30 million page views a month, I think, appearing on TV a lot. And so, in this new era, you can't basically, it's much harder to start at a local publication and move your way up to like a network or a national newspaper. It's, the smarter way is to, and I know maybe like it may feel risky, but just to move to a big city and try to get a job at a top publication. So if that's Chicago or New York or DC or Atlanta, like that's the way. It's rather than going to North Dakota or like some very small town and making your way up, because that newspaper is likely not to be very strong right now, and unfortunately, and so it's it's easier to, it's kind of, we have a meritocracy, and so it used to be journalism and journalism jobs were based on years of experience, but now it's based on smarts and intelligence. It doesn't matter how old you are. So I'd love to take any questions anyone has about journalism, politics, covering Trump leaks in the White House. So thank you so much. So I think the one challenge is finding unique stories. And so, because every day there will be something that everyone is talking about. So today and yesterday was Judge Roy Moore and his sexual assault allegations. And so, me as a 27-year-old reporter, I didn't break that story, and so I don't have like a ton of new ideas to move the ball forward. But there are ways to kind of pick away at stories that are less well covered. And so for me, that's been covering the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, Corey Lewandowski, Trump's former campaign manager, and establishing sources on those beats that will feed you information. And the name of the game always is scoops, and that comes through both access and things that are that they don't want out there. And so, one story I had this summer was, late this summer, was I just had an idea in my head, are people still interested in going to work for the State Department? And there's an easy way of tracking that, which is the Foreign Service Officer test, which anyone, if you want to join the State Department, you have to take this test. And so I asked for the data from the State Department, and they just sent it over. And I looked at last year and the last couple of years of trends, and it had gone way down. It had gone 30% down. And then this, I talked to people who were less interested in joining the State Department and people who were not going to take the test anymore. And that story hadn't been written. And so it's finding that those types of stories, and also getting trust of senators and congressmen, and some meeting with them off the record, and getting their cell phone numbers or their personal emails, because comms people, they're great, but they're not going to be that helpful always. And they're always going to be looking out for their boss and making their boss look good. But if you keep a good relationship with the principal, then you can just text, so-and-so representative, and, and don't just text them when you need something, but, just like sometimes I send articles to congressmen that I know would be interested in them. So if it's like Darrell Issa, then like sending them an article in like California. Even I've done this strategy, which is to sometimes just like go running or go biking with some of your sources, and play tennis with them, and so whatever you guys share in common, and you don't want to get captured by your source, but you can. That will break the ice a little bit. So if you've gone, instead of just dealing on like a one-on-one professional basis, if you form a personal source relationship with someone, then they're more likely to trust you and they will answer your call when you have a work question.
Just wondering, with Trump, it's almost Stalinist, like you say, that he's aware of all the bad stories, but isn't that sort of flip too, that if somebody writes a nice story about him, you're his best friend? Is there something to that? And it changes every 10 minutes, doesn't it?
He's been famous for doing this, and it's been well reported that he will, I don't know if he has time to do this now, but he would get printouts of stories that were favorable to him, and, write a comment saying like, great job, you nailed it, and then sign his name, and then send it to the reporter. And so I think he still did that even as president, and I guess that's nice. I'm still waiting for my envelope. But we were worried a little bit when the administration started that, are they going to still want to cooperate with Politico, or will we still have some access? And thankfully, they still want to play ball, and some of them are more professional and more outward facing. They're more proactive than just reactive in the comm shop and in general. I've told people in the White House, feel free to flag any stories and I will take a look and maybe include them in Playbook if there are like good stories about you guys, and it's very rarely that they do. And so I think there's this crisis mentality where it's just like, well, they don't actually make the time to have a strategic plan or send stories or pitch stories that are, make them look good. And in the past administration, they would, President Obama's comms folks would call us up and say, this is an agenda, this is a message we're driving today or tomorrow. And with Trump, they don't, even the White House doesn't know, and so it makes it much harder. And sometimes just to loop back, he would take a negative article and say, this is totally wrong, like, you should get your facts straight, and send it to them too. And so it wasn't just positive stories that he would do.
Many of your students are involved in writing newsletters like yours, not exactly like yours. So can you talk for just a few minutes about the strategy or philosophy on what makes your newsletter work, or what makes your newsletter special among all the many political newsletters out there?
Sure. So, there has been this explosion since Playbook and other newsletters started of email tip sheets that go into people's inbox, and that that's kind of a function of how it's very easy to read, and people don't like sorting through, a million different newspapers or publications. And so if you provide a one-stop shop, then you can, then you can get all your news in 5 to 10 minutes. And we've seen subscriptions go up, pretty every day. I don't know exactly how many, but we've seen growth of maybe like 30% since we took over the Playbook a year and a half ago. And I think it's, especially now under Trump, there's this massive influx of news that we started an afternoon edition, and so our process for writing the newsletters, basically our sources are our best, or our readers are our best sources in terms of they are flagging stuff to us, or they will send us tips. And even if it's like fun things like, where in Jared and Ivanka were having dinner last night, or, federal bureaucrats will, I know one of them once, he texted me, I talked to him on the phone, and his tip was a good one, which was that the Department of Homeland Security, they were going to fund a group that was fighting they were funding white extremist groups, and so they were fighting against that. And, the department stopped, they kept every other grant in this program except for that one. And so he told me, pay attention to this. You should write a little item or a story, and I did that, and that got, some good pickup. And so it's people often want to be in the newsletter, or they want to be, stay out of it if it's a negative story. And usually we don't like. It's usually what our readers want to know about. That's more important than I want to stay out. So if sometimes the White House says, can you not include this story, then that makes us think, well, that must be a good story, so we'll just put it in. So it can kind of backfire. Like, you don't remind us about the negative stories. And so our strategy is to write like a very accessible newsletter that is fun to read. And it's gotten longer since we started, but I think most journalists would agree in Washington that there's never been as much news, and so you want to cover both Trump and other things that are going on. So you can add to our newsletter list, and so I think if you just pass that, if you fill out the sign card, then I think there are people that will collect them.
You talked earlier about how Trump talked about women about her tweets and trying to bring them back to her, and I'm just a college student trying to look for a job sort of level. I've heard rumors of people on interviews just pulling up someone's Twitter just to see like what they've been tweeting about. And I know that when Twitter, for instance, started, it was more of a way to let people know like just what you were doing. But now I feel like it's turned into something that is just an extension of what you should be doing. And we've had people come to classes that say everything that you should be tweeting out or putting on social media should be like branded and with a purpose. So what are your thoughts? Do you think that it should be a mixture, or should we just not be talking about social things? I feel like that's just a way, as a college student who maybe, 5 years ago wasn't thinking about their job, maybe you were tweeting about things that might not be seen in your favor, and 5 years ago you're looking for a job.
I was, when I was applying to college, the college admission counselors would tell us the same thing, which is that they will look at your Facebook and your Instagram and Twitter and see if there are any photos of you, engaging in behavior that they don't want on campus. And I think that just extends your whole life, and I think, the reality is the tech companies have a lot of, power over our lives, and that carries over to when you're applying for a job. And so if you it might just behoove anyone who's looking for a job just to have one of their friends or one of their adult mentors kind of just take a look at their Twitter or their Facebook, anything that's public, and see, is there anything that you have to delete, or as you're applying to jobs. And you don't have to totally just have every tweet be something that is professional. You can still have like a fun Twitter account, but especially political views too. So if you were if you're applying for a nonpartisan political reporting job, like, you have to get rid of anything on Facebook or Twitter that makes you seem like you have a political leaning if you did. And so it sounds like whitewashing history, but it's worth it to if you want to get a job. And so you can't tell employers, you don't look at my stuff on social, because just put yourself in the shoes of, if you're a person who's hiring, don't you want to see the full perspective of who you might get? And so it's a reasonable thing that people would look like. Just people do that in all walks of life now. Someone they're meeting for coffee or like a potential date, like it's people are curious, and so they want to know, and so you can't stop them.
So when you go to write an article, do you do it? Do you try to be nonpartisan? Do you try to be open-minded, or do you have your own political agenda that you're trying to advance with articles that you write?
So there are some publications like The Nation or Breitbart or The Daily Caller, which are either left or right. At Politica, we think that there's a space, the space in the marketplace that we occupy is nonpartisan, and so it's reporting that is fair and balanced and just it's down the middle. And so a lot of the stories we frankly do now are investigating Trump and the administration, but doing it in a fair way, and so always giving them a chance to comment and not just going after them for the sake of that. And so it's mostly public interest journalism, and writing, when Democrats are in power, we're going to do the same thing. And so it's just a matter of who has the power. And so when I write a story or playbook in the morning, it's based on like what I'm interested in or what I think readers should know, and it's not any political ideology I have is much less important, and I don't want that reflected at all in how I write, because I don't want to undermine the readers' trust in me. Because if you don't have credibility with your readers, then you are not going to be trusted, and no one will give you good information, and you'll be viewed as a partisan hack. And your reputation is everything, and especially in DC. And so, if you keep a good reputation, then people will continue to go to you. And so, it's just a matter of going where the facts are. And so, if that makes Republicans or Trump or Democrats look good or bad, that is just a matter of what you uncover, and if you're a good enough journalist to find stuff that hasn't been reported. It's not based on, I want to make this person look bad. Thank you.
I have to admit that I owe Daniel an apology simply because I got him to hold the mic for the past 45 minutes. We forgot to hook him up with this particular device, and the result is he may well have a sore elbow. But anyway, thank you all very much for being here. I think it's been a very good day of discussion, of talks about what is happening in the political firmament. I certainly enjoyed Lloyd Ambrosius's conversation this morning, tracing the history of media and the presidency from the ratification of the Constitution through to today's social media. Deb's particularly stellar international odyssey that took us through images of Trump and so on overseas, and then Lyle's really erudite discourse on the First Amendment and what is happening vis-a-vis truth and falsehood in Washington, D.C. So I think we've had some great discussions, also Gus Horowitz's and various other people's as well as Daniel's. So thank you all very much for being here, and we would hope to repeat this particular type of symposium a year from now. Our initial intent was to keep an eye on what is happening in Washington, D.C. and engage people in discussion about this and in talks about it on the anniversary of the election for the 4-year term of President Trump, assuming that there are 4 years. I have to say that I'm not so sure I'm as optimistic as some people today are about President Trump and the damage or lack thereof that he can do. I know in looking at Lyle's presentation, he certainly is very optimistic about the future of this country, and I know that Bloomberg recently came out with a story about how President Trump is in fact not damaging any of our constitutional protections. So I think there probably is reason to be optimistic, but on a day-to-day news cycle, sometimes the news is less than savory. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Have a great weekend. And again, thanks to all our participants who did a tremendous job for us. And thanks very much to Nicole, who, as I said earlier this morning, arranged all the logistics, did a wonderful job on all of that, and made it possible for us to have participants here because she followed up with people on travel arrangements, hotel arrangements, and so on. So thanks again to Nicole, Haley, and the other staff members who were very much involved in all of this. Thanks again.